And we are so honored to have you all here with us. Just stay with us. There's already 700 people in the room, and we're going to just give folks a second to sign on. Hello, Secretary King. We're just getting started with our event, State of Student Debt Summit, and we'll be going to your panel within the next half hour.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Yes, we have over now 771 and growing. So we're just giving folks a bit of time.
That's awesome.
Majority Leader Schumer should be joining us shortly.
Excellent.
Americans owe more than $1.7 trillion in student loans. That's more than credit cards and auto debt.
More than 43 million people are burdened by student loan debt nationwide. Young voters paved the way for President Biden's path to the White House in 2020.
Now, Democrats are growing concerned the president's lack of action to erase student loan debt could cost the party votes in the midterm election.
We as a country are profiting off of insurmountable and crushing educational debt, and it is wrong.
It's a race issue, it's a gender issue, it's an equality issue.
They stand in the way of people getting the job they want. They stand in the way of buying a home, of starting a family, of buying a car.
The economic toll of the pandemic has made it tough for a quarter of all adults to pay their bills. People have stayed afloat by using the money that would have gone to student loan payments on all the other essential costs.
Tick tock, Mr. President. Millions of Americans ask you now to pick up a pen and cancel student loan debt.
Canceling student debt by executive action is one of the most effective ways President Biden can provide sweeping relief to millions of families.
It will be an act of justice, economic stimulus, and urgently needed relief all at once. Let's cancel student debt today and set our young people on a path to a more financially secure, just future.
No student debt! No student debt!
You don't need Congress. All you need is the flick of a pen.
Wow. And hello and welcome to the State of Student Debt Virtual Summit. We have maxed out our Zoom room with over 1,000 of you on, and thank you to everyone that's joining us on YouTube as well, and all of the lawmakers, advocates, and experts, and especially you, the student loan borrowers joining us from across the country today. We are honored. We have a very special guest for you today. We're honored to be joined by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Majority Leader Schumer has been leading the fight tirelessly in Washington to cancel student debt. He introduced Senate Resolution 46, calling on President Biden to use his executive action to cancel that debt. And recently, the senator has joined student loan borrowers on the ground through virtual town halls, where he has energized those of us that want to create meaningful change. And I know, Senator, you've definitely energized us here at Student Debt Crisis Center. I know personally that the Majority Leader is deeply committed to this issue, and it is our pleasure to have him once again to share his time and joining our State of Student Debt Summit. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Majority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer. Senator Schumer, do we have you on the line? There you are. You're on mute, Senator.
Okay, there we are.
Go. Hello.
Talia, I heard you, and let me just say thank you for saying I inspire students, but right back at you, babe. You inspire me, and you inspire all of us, and who inspires us the most are the millions of students, young, middle-aged, and even elderly, who still have student debt, who are working so hard for this cause. This is something I believe in. It's amazing to me that we could just take a burden off people's shoulders so easily. With the flick of a pen, the president can do it. Student debt is one of the very biggest things holding our economy back. When people have to pay that check every month to a student, to a loan, often they signed up not even knowing what they were getting into. When they have to do that, when they have to pay those checks, they're not buying a car, they're not establishing a career, they're not doing so many things, going on a vacation that pump up our economy. You know, for years and years and years, when I was in school, I could work my way through school. My family didn't have much money, but you could get out without debt. That can't happen anymore. College is so expensive that even if you work your butt off, you're not going to be able to emerge without this huge amount of debt on your shoulders. And so what's happened is that college, which used to just be the ladder up, you know, for families like mine, who for generations, no one went to college. It was, wow, a ladder up. But with student debt, it's an anchor down, because you get out of college and you have all this debt. So it's certainly true that it is one of the most, I have told the president, this is one of the most important things he can do to help our economy grow. We all want the economy to grow. We all want people to have good lives where you can provide for yourself and your family. We want our young people to realize that they can have a good future. One of the best, very best, top of the list ways to do it is by canceling student debt, by getting rid of the $50,000, even going higher after that, and doing it. Take the story of somebody who is, I think you're going to hear from soon, who I met over the course of the pandemic, a fellow New Yorker, Sabrina Calazans. She's a first-generation college graduate. She began looking for work a few months before the start of the pandemic, and just one of the worst moments imaginable if you're looking to get your life started. She tried her hardest, but was unable to find consistent work in her field. She did a lot of what recent graduates do. She moved back, lived with her family. She couldn't afford rent. But even when she got home, those challenges didn't go away because of COVID. Her mom wasn't getting as much work and Sabrina had to find ways to support her family. So even with the scholarships and grants, she had $40,000 of loans to pay off. She would have likely faced ruin had the federal government not paused all the payments on student loan debts. And don't get me wrong, the pause is a good thing, but it ain't enough. It ain't close to enough. There are tens of millions of young Americans out there, like Sabrina, and many of them are borrowers of color, people of color, Black people, brown people, Asian folks have gotten this burden even more on their shoulders than others, because many have never been to college in the first place. Many were taken advantage of when particularly some of the for-profit colleges told them lies. So this is an issue that is so important for millions of families, millions of families. The pause allowed people to save an average, listen to this, $400 a month, $393 a month. That's the average. That is so much money. How does anybody live knowing every month I got to pay this $400 every month? So the pause has stopped that, but make no mistake about it. This pause isn't going to stay forever. And the canceling of student debt is the way to go, the way to go. Sooner or later, it's going to end, and we need this. Sabrina and tens of millions of others agree. We don't just need student loans paused, we need them erased. Now, I have talked personally to the president on this issue a whole bunch of times. I have told him that this is more important than just about anything else that he can do on his own. I don't want people to have to reach their 40s and 50s and still have to worry about how they're going to pay this debt. This burden, which puts a cloud over your life, should be removed. Flick of a pen can do it. Flick of a pen can do it. So we must get this done. So we're working on it. We're making progress, folks. We are making progress. The White House seems more open to it than ever before. I would repeat my plea. Not only you, I'm sure everyone on this Zoom has already, and everyone watching YouTube has done it already. Call, email, whatever you do, write the White House and tell them you need it done. But I'd like everyone on this Zoom and everyone listening on YouTube to raise their hands and pledge that you will try to get 5 people to do the same. We're getting closer and closer to getting this done. I won't rest until it's done. I hope all of you will join us. If we got rid of student debt, our economy would take off. That anchor that's so tying down so many of our young and middle-aged people would go away. And America would be a better, happier, more prosperous place. President Biden, excuse me, please join us. Please join us. Students, parents, everybody who cares, continue to write, call, email. Get 5 people to do it. We'll get this done. So I want to thank Natalia. I want to thank Cody. I want to thank the Student Debt Crisis Center. We're going to keep fighting until we win.
Well, I pledge. I will keep telling millions of people, and definitely I think we can all have 5 people send emails, sign petitions, reach out. And Senator Schumer, we also have Sabrina Calazans on today.
Yes, I heard.
Yes.
Great. Hi, Sabrina. Are you there?
I'm here, Senator. How are you?
Hi, nice to see you.
It's good to see you as well.
Thank you for caring so much.
And thank you for being a champion for this issue. It's really great to have someone representing me in Congress who is really speaking out and fighting for this. And it's something that will help not only me, but millions of people across the country. So I really thank you for your efforts.
Well, you're great. And there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Sabrinas across this country who want this done. So please stay active. Please, please, please do not give up. Look, some of the greatest fights in America, whether it was for civil rights or when I was young, you couldn't vote till you were 21. We fought hard to get the vote to 18. They were drafting people into Vietnam. And we said, if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote. And we never gave up and we won. If this force on this Zoom and people like you keep at it, we're going to win.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Sabrina.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, Sabrina came to Student Debt Crisis Center by filling out a survey and explaining what she was going through during COVID with her student loans. And that led to Sabrina. Actually, I'll let you share. Please share about your meeting with Secretary Cardona and I believe Senator Schumer as well.
Yes.
Yes, I ended up filling out a survey, and from there I was asked to share my story. And so that's when I learned that sharing my story and my experiences is so important. And having the chance to speak with Senator Schumer, with Senator Warren, with Secretary Cardona is so important. Being able to tell them how it's impacting me, but it's not just me, it's who I'm representing. It's the people, in my state, in my country, it's everyone who's being impacted. It's not just me, it's my family, it's my finances, it's my mental health. It affects people of all ages, not just young people. It affects people whose Social Security are being garnished. It's people who are having their income garnished as well. And so it's also disproportionately impacting people of color. I am a first-generation American, first-generation college graduate. And so I didn't have that support system, where I didn't have that knowledge of student debt beforehand. So I saw that impact, and I see that impact on myself and my community. Low-income communities and women are mostly impacted as well. And so that's why I really support student debt cancellation, and why I was at that rally in DC last week fighting for student debt cancellation, because President Biden made promises, and now he must keep those promises to millions of people. And with the flick of a pen, as Senator Schumer has said, he can improve the lives of borrowers, of our country, of our families, and our economy. And so I realized, as I said, by sharing my story, how important it is, how impactful it is, because it feels like with student debt, it's each of us on our own fighting. But when we come together as a collective, we really have so much influence and power in this country. So as Senator Schumer said, let's pledge to share this with 5 other people, with 10 other people, with our social media, followers, whoever it may be. Reach out to people, tell them about your story, and do what you can so that we can make a difference and get this to President Biden so that he will sign it and help us move forward in our lives.
Speechless. I couldn't have said it better, Sabrina. I just love that you have joined us as a supporter at Student Debt Crisis Center, and continue, now that you have found a job, but continue to advocate for borrowers whenever and wherever you can.
Thank you, Sabrina. You are one great advocate, one great New Yorker. I'm proud of you. And your story could be told by millions of others. And don't be shy, folks, about telling your stories. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. You were working to make yourself a better life. That's what we want in this country. And this obstacle, no fault of your own, got in the way. So just tell your stories. Make sure you write and call. We're going to win this fight. We're going to win this fight.
We're not giving up.
Right.
And, we've turned your quote with the flick of a pen. We put it on a pen, and we will send those your way, Senator, because we need to keep getting that word out. And so appreciate your time.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you, Rocco. And thank you, the thousands and thousands who are listening today. We need your help, but we will win this fight together. We will not fail.
Thank you, Senator.
Bye-bye.
And thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you.
To all the borrowers and folks on the line, stay with us. We have jam-packed programming. I'd like to introduce our executive director sitting next to me, Cody Hunanian. Cody?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to highlight something you said earlier. We have 1,000 people on the line right now, and I just looked, we have nearly 300 people on YouTube. So we are in the thousands. If you close your eyes and picture a room, a theater full of 1,000 people fighting for student debt cancellation and reforms to the system, I mean, that is just huge. Yeah. So let's not underestimate the power of today's event. I'm also watching us on Twitter. For those of us that are online, I see some members of the press are talking about today's event. So this is the event for student loan borrowers. We're happy that everyone is here. And so I'm going to just go over some quick housekeeping. We'll introduce the event, and then we have our first panel starting in just 10 minutes. So I see folks are very active in the chat right now. Thank you so much. I'm going to put in the chat just some quick guidelines and rules. We know that talking about student loan debt can be challenging, and there's a lot of stigma around debt. This movement has done a lot of work to tear that down, but we want everyone to feel comfortable and safe sharing their stories, sharing their opinions. Our organization's goal is to echo your voices, and we can't do that if folks aren't comfortable sharing their thoughts. And so I just ask of everyone, We want to hear you. Please share your experience. Just be sure to be respectful, considerate, and understanding when using the chat function. If there's anything that's, offensive, we may have to remove you, and we don't want that to happen. We definitely want everyone, all 1,000 of you, to be able to join us for this entire day. So I will put in the chat here for everyone just some quick guidelines so we can all enjoy the summit. So there that is. So yeah, with that, I'll get us started for today's event. So today is the State of Student Debt Summit. We are bringing together lawmakers, the top advocates and experts, and of course, borrowers like you. We have to bring borrowers into the conversation. You just heard from Senator Schumer. He is thrilled to hear from everyday people. We're going to have some really important discussions starting in about 8 minutes at 1 p.m. Eastern. We're going to have a panel called The Path to Debt Cancellation, Combining Research and Advocacy, where we're going to talk about the data that informs this movement. After that, we will have another panel, Women and Student Debt, a $1 trillion crisis, to talk about why women hold 2/3 of America's student loan debt. And lastly, we're going to answer the question, what does it mean to cancel student loan debt? You're probably hearing about it everywhere, but us advocates want to make sure you understand what we mean by that. So we just heard from Senate Majority Leader Schumer, who is one of the strongest champions for student debt reform in Washington. But that is not all today. In just a few moments, we will hear from former U.S. Secretary of Education, John B. King. He is the first Secretary of Education to support student debt cancellation. Later today, we will hear special remarks from Senator Elizabeth Warren. And in between all that, like I said, we will have the top minds and advocates working on this issue. It is really exciting. So if you have student debt, but one of your loved ones does, this is the event to be at. We will give you all the information you need to understand this crisis and to help end it. And the best part is we have folks, like I said, all over the country on Zoom and on YouTube, which means that anyone can join us today. So now is the time. If you have a friend or family member who cares about this issue, please feel free to share this event so they can join us as well.
The State of Student Debt Virtual Summit is hosted by our team at the Student Debt Crisis Center. And we're really happy to be joined by our Economic Justice Fellows, Vivek Kakar and Orlando Caballo. And Sabrina, who used to work for us. We're so grateful that you came on to share our story. At Student Debt Crisis Center, we are a nonprofit organization centering the needs and voices of borrowers and partnering with allies to impact public policy and once and for all end this student debt crisis. Importantly, we are a people-powered movement representing over 2 million supporters, and thousands of you are here joining us today. And we're also joined by our allies and partners at Next Gen America, Student Borrower Protection Center, the National Consumer Law Center, United States of Women, and Young Invincibles, along with Next Gen Policy. So many of these, if you've been at summits before, you've seen some of these organizations. They're great partners. We cannot do this alone. As it stands right now, there's over 420 nonprofits and organizations, labor unions that are supporting debt cancellation. And as Senator Schumer said, with a flick of a pen, we want Biden to do this and we want him to do it now.
Great. Well, I see we are really close to our first panel beginning. I'm just going to remind folks one more time, please consider sharing your experience or your story in the chat. At the end of today's event, around 4 to 4:15, we will have an audience Q&A. So we will certainly try to address a lot of the questions that you all are asking us. I see folks from different parts of the country. I see folks from different age groups. I see folks from different backgrounds. And they're all bringing a completely different perspective to this topic. That has me so excited. This is a diverse audience, and we're going to talk about all of the issues that matter to student loan borrowers. So I see some of our panelists are logging in right now. We're going to start with a quick introduction video for this panel, and then we'll get started in just a few minutes.
ultimately, we should see higher education as a public good. It's good for everyone in the country if students have the opportunity to get a college degree. It makes them better prepared for the 21st century economy, helps prepare them for citizenship. Just as we see K-12 education as a public good, we should view public higher education as a shared responsibility.
When we talk about the student debt crisis, we need to address all the ways this crisis is actively harming our communities. Not only are borrowers struggling to bear the weight of student debt, countless Black and brown students are having their dreams of applying to college shattered due to the extremely high debt burden they will undoubtedly face. On average, Black women graduate with $6,000 more in student debt than white women, widening the racial and gender wealth gap even further. It's time for President Biden to use his executive authority to cancel student debt.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vivek Kakar, and I'm an Economic Justice Fellow here at the Student Debt Crisis Center. We're so glad you could make it to today's informative summit. I'm beyond excited for this next panel, The Path to Debt Cancellation, Combining Research and Advocacy, featuring Assistant Professor at UC Merced, Charlie Eaton, Assistant Professor at the University of Iowa, and non-residential Brookings Fellow in Governance Studies, Louise Seamstert, and former US Secretary of Education and President of the Education Trust, John B. King. And moderating this panel is our very own Cody Hunanian, the Executive Director here at the Student Debt Crisis Center. Cody, we're ready for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vivek. And it looks like we have Secretary King on. Charlie, Luis, are you with us as well?
I'm here.
Hello. Hey, guys. All right, great. Well, this is a really exciting panel. I want to just start this discussion by kind of just level setting. This is going to be a conversation about combining research and advocacy. And so it does mean we're going to be talking about some interesting topics, but these might be new topics for a lot of people that are joining us today. So I want to start with just a round of questions for each one of you to really set the groundwork. Secretary King, I'm going to go to you first because I'm just so thrilled to have you today. Thank you for being here. You have come out as the first U.S. Secretary of Education to support student debt. And you certainly have a unique perspective as someone who understands this issue from the inside and the outside. So I have to ask what many people are thinking, which is, how did you come to this conclusion? And what did you learn about America's student debt crisis along your journey that made you get behind canceling student loan debt?
Well, thanks, Cody, for the opportunity to join you, and thanks for the work that the Student Debt Crisis Center does. Look, the context for me is that I got into education as a teacher and principal because I believe that education saves lives. When I was a kid, both my parents passed away when I was little, my mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. The thing that saved me was school. So I've always believed education has this critical role to play in our society. When I became secretary, we were very focused on having more rigorous enforcement against predatory for-profit colleges that have been taking advantage of students. We launched an enforcement unit. We shut down an institution like ITT through our enforcement efforts. We were very focused on creating a process for debt cancellation so that the folks who were victimized by these predatory for-profit colleges would have a way to be made whole. We built that process and used our executive authority to create a process that now is being used by the Biden administration to cancel debt for large numbers of students. So it's very clear that the federal government, particularly the executive branch, has the authority to cancel debt. We also were very focused on trying to improve income-driven repayment plans. And our hope was, in the Obama administration, that income-driven repayment would help address the student debt crisis. But the reality is, it hasn't. Now, I, after leaving the administration, went to the Education Trust, a research and advocacy organization that works on equity issues. And we focus particularly on the disproportionate impact of the student debt crisis on African Americans. Now, this is in the context of our racial wealth gap as a country, the reality that there's a 10-to-1 gap in the level of wealth of the median net worth white family compared to the median net worth African-American family. And in that context, Black students are more likely to borrow, and they are borrowing more. We wrote a report at the Ed Trust called Jim Crow Debt, How Black Borrowers Experience Student Loans. And what we heard in that report was income-driven repayment wasn't working. We heard from folks about folks delaying buying a house, starting a business, having kids because of the impact of debt in their lives. We found that 8 out of 10 of the borrowers that we surveyed who were in income-driven repayment plans were still saying that their student loans were the primary source of financial stress in their lives. And so over time, it became very clear to me that income-driven repayment was not doing enough. And the crisis has continued to grow. We now have more than $1.8 trillion of student debt for more than 43 million borrowers, and continued pressure on students, particularly Black students, because of the debt crisis. And then COVID hit, and we could see the disproportionate impact COVID was having on low-income communities and communities of color. And to me, what that suggested is that this should be a New Deal moment, a moment for our country to actually take on some of our deeper systemic challenges and correct the policy mistake of the last 40 years. Because if you look back to 1980, in 1980, Pell Grants were available to a larger share of students, and Pell Grants covered 80% of the cost of college. Today, it's less than a third. So what's happened over 40 years is we've transferred the cost of college from being a public good to now being a matter of students and their parents borrowing. And so we have an opportunity, I think, as we recover from COVID, to correct that, to make this a New Deal moment. It is very clear that President Biden has the authority to cancel debt for all borrowers. He should do that. And at the same time, as a country, we need to solve this problem going forward. At a minimum, we should make community college tuition free, and we should double the Pell Grant program. That'd be a good start. But there are a number of proposals in Congress to make college debt free. And that's what we should do, because at the end of the day, our society is better off if we make it possible for folks to access higher education. And we should see it as a public good in the same spirit as our K-12 schools. Now, doing that will also require us to reflect on our society and how we've organized ourselves as a society and what we think really matters as a public investment. But I think higher education should be that. And I'll end on this note. You know, I'm talking to you from Silver Spring, Maryland, about 25 miles from where my great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The cabin where my great-grandfather was enslaved still standing on the property. That's 3 generations. How did we go in 3 generations from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first Black president? Well, a big part of that was University of Maryland Eastern Shore, where my grandmother graduated in 1894. Higher education should be a path to opportunity and not a sentence to a lifetime of debt. And we have the chance as a society to change that. It starts with canceling debt for all borrowers.
Secretary, I'm smiling because I think we've got a room of about 1,000 people who agree with everything you just said. I'm glad that you shared your personal story. You know, as an organization that collects stories, it's important to recognize that so many of us, you know, pursued higher education because of exactly what you just said, that it was a path to a better future. And because of this student debt, it has created roadblocks. So I'm glad that you're talking about this issue, not only as a student debt crisis, but unleashing the potential of Americans by freeing them from this debt. I don't know if you have anything you want to add there, but I just like that you're talking about both sides of this issue.
I just say quickly, and I can't wait to hear from Charlie and Louise. They've both done such excellent work on this issue. But I think Senator Schumer made an important point that this is an opportunity for us to grow our economy, to unleash the talent of folks that's trapped because they are burdened by debt. So this is something that is good for not only the borrowers themselves, but good for the country.
Great. And we'll certainly come back to you soon, Secretary. Right before today's discussion, I actually got a call from a borrower in Maryland. So I know folks in the state want to hear from you, but let's move on. I want to go to Luis Seamster. Luis, we just heard from both Senator Schumer and Secretary King. They both talked about how student loan debt is a racial equity issue. And I know so much of your work on student debt is centered around racial equity. And I want this audience to be able to fully understand your perspective on this issue, because I think it is just so important. So can you give us a quick lesson on the racial wealth gap, what it is, and how we should think about student debt cancellation with a focus on wealth?
Sure, and thank you for having me. As a researcher of inequality primarily, I fell into student debt backwards, trying to understand what was happening with the racial wealth gap. And I kind of think that's important to say, to show how important this issue is for racial equality. And to admit, I didn't understand that at first, when I first was, just doing our work and trying to advance racial equity, that I've now committed to this as being a major source of current racial inequality. As Secretary King said, the racial wealth gap is and has been stable at about $10 of white wealth for every $1 of median Black wealth, evaluated by the families, since we started measuring it in the 60s. And that's been pretty consistent, despite all the political and social and economic advances that Black folks have made since the civil rights movement, except for the recession, when it actually got much worse for a period of time. And actually half of Black wealth was lost in just 5 years. And that was what got me first circling around these problems, thinking, how could that happen so quickly? We're supposed to think about wealth as this slowly growing thing. We were supposed to think of this racial wealth gap as very large, but perhaps slowly closing, and that hopefully all these policies that we'd implemented would change things. But that's actually not how wealth works. Once you have wealth, it starts growing on its own in your investments. If you do not have wealth, that is not happening for you. So we are not going to slowly and naturally close this gap on its own. We need to understand what caused it, whether that's our historic building the economy off of slavery, or the policies that came since then, like making low-cost mortgages available primarily to white families in the 20th century in ways that then built white wealth and built the white middle class in many ways, at the expense of Black and Brown Americans who were not able to use debt in that way to create and leverage wealth. So I've been thinking about debt and wealth together. We often measure debt as the opposite of your assets. But I have been arguing that these need to be understood as two separate dimensions, because whether or not debt pays off for you really depends on whether you have wealth behind it. So a wealthy family whose child takes on a large amount of debt to go to med school is going to have a really different experience with those hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt than a family who has zero wealth and is taking on that same amount of debt. And yet we act as if that's an equal opportunity, is the ability to go to med school itself, and that everything else will sort itself out later and your income's supposed to account for that. And we know, due to the differences, these very large racial differences in wealth and wealth hoarding and the opportunities to build wealth over this time, that's not happening. The last thing I'll say is that wealth is primarily inherited. So when we talk about opportunities to build wealth, that's kind of a misnomer for understanding how these dynamics work. And so this matters for kind of the story of higher education itself being like the pathway to opportunity, because really this is all coming up behind us, not in people's future, that everyone has the equal ability to build fabulous wealth. We need to really rethink how some of these policies we still have today have been recreating and compounding some of the problems with wealth inequality that we have. I thought one last thing quickly, because this matters for borrowers, is that we started looking at the racial wealth gap for student borrowers, because if education leads to greater equality, that should mean that the wealth gap is smaller for people with student debt. And in fact, we found that it is actually much larger for Black and white borrowers. meaning that higher education and the way that we're financing is not closing the racial wealth gap, it's actually expanding it. And that, I think that's one more important point to bring into this conversation.
Luis, I think all of those, facts and all that information is so important, but there's something you said at the beginning of your statement that really resonated with me. And I want to just underline it real quick, but you mentioned that you didn't know this issue before you started researching. You didn't realize that there was this racial wealth gap. And I just want to flag, like, part of the reason we're having this conversation is because we need data and information and research to really characterize what the student debt crisis is. And it's great if advocates like our organization have been calling it a crisis for many years, but without the research, without uncovering new information, we really haven't been able to push this issue forward. So we all have been learning a lot of new things about the student debt crisis, and that's helped us all fight for change more. I wonder then, not to put you on the spot, but if there's any misconceptions that you think are still lingering as you're, peeling back the layers further and further that you wish we could, as a general public, know more about.
Right. I think that, thanks for that opportunity. I think that I agree that we've been describing it as a crisis for so long that we have a hard time kind of tracking the change in that over time, and how recently this became a problem and how quickly things are getting worse. So even just in the time since we published our first paper on this in 2017, when we were showing that Black debt had increased threefold in 12 years, and that seemed like a really significant problem, even as the number of Black households taking on student debt had also increased significantly. When we went to update those numbers in 2020, we found that it had gotten much, much worse when we were adding on the 6 new years of data. And so by now, the increase in median Black student debt looks like an exponential increase. And there's no reason why that would stop increasing due to things like the interest accumulation, which I know many borrowers are really rightly focused on, the pressure to go to debt, and the fact that it's just not, people are not able to get out from under it. So it's simply increasing and will continue to increase if there's no repayment pause within the absence of some amount of cancellation or other policy changes. That really wrapping our head around the scope of the problem, and we and other researchers kind of converged around this issue around the same time, showing no matter what survey we were looking at, no matter whether you're looking at borrowers from longer ago longitudinally or a cross section of people, we were seeing the same thing, which was that Black student debt was rising very, very quickly. Student debt was going up very quickly for everybody, and this is a problem for everyone. But the fact that it's racially targeted draws attention to those dynamics that Secretary King was identifying for for-profit schools, of targeting marginalized students and having differential effects for marginalized students. Looks like it's playing out overall over our whole country.
Yeah, thank you for adding there. All right, I'm going to toss it now to our third panelist, Charlie. Charlie, you just released a book. It's called Bankers in the Ivory Tower: The Troubling Rise of Financiers in the U.S. Higher Education. Part of your research for this book was tracking exactly how the debt cancellation movement got to where it is today. And so that's a little bit of different type of research than kind of the economic and number-oriented stuff. So I think this is a great opportunity to run us through, what it is that you learned, and tell us why right now in this moment there's so much support for student debt cancellation policies.
Thanks, Cody. Amazing to join this panel. It was incredible to hear Secretary King and Louise make the case for debt cancellation. And like you said, research and data analysis has been very important to this. But the story I'm going to tell is how it actually started with borrowers telling their truths. And this really aligns with what Louise said and what Secretary King said about where, we as researchers at our universities and with Secretary King's team at EdTrust, we were responding to what we were hearing from borrowers that didn't fit the dominant narrative about student debt. And so kind of the question that I had, that I address in this last chapter of my book is, it steps back and it says, who created these ideas to cancel debt, and how did they come up with them and get them to be so popular? And these, I think, are really important questions to ask because, like Secretary King said, once we get debt cancellation done, then the hard part starts of building a debt-free higher education system so that we don't end up right back where we started. And I think asking, how did we come up with the idea of debt cancellation? How did we make it so popular? How did we assemble the research behind it that has made the case so strong? Asking how that happened is a useful question for thinking about how we're going to take these next steps. And I'm going to tell you about a few different people who did, I think, some particularly important things to promote debt cancellation over the last decade. But together, I think their contributions show three things have really been crucial for popularizing debt cancellation. And the first thing is that borrowers started to tell their own stories of how student debt was holding them back. And they did this through groups like yours, through Student Debt Crisis Center, through the Debt Collective, and through a range of racial justice organizations. The second thing is that borrower groups got researchers like Louise and me and Secretary King's team at EdTrust, and also legal aid and consumer protection lawyers, the media, and policymakers to start talking with borrowers about their struggles and their truths. And that helped us to start realizing the dominant narrative that student loans were a ticket to opportunity did not fit the experience, the real lived experience of borrowers. And then ultimately, it really wasn't any one person or group of people that popularized the idea of debt cancellation. Instead, it was this loose coalition of different groups that came together in support of borrowers. And these different groups worked together to build a new narrative, this narrative that we've heard, that we should cancel student debt to deliver relief to distressed borrowers, to undo the injustice of racial inequalities in student debt, and to hit the reset button on how we pay for higher education. And these different groups, the borrowers, the racial justice groups, the researchers, the lawyers, the policymakers, they all contributed different types of expertise to say not only why we should cancel student debt, but how we should do it. So let's start real quick with that first crucial thing of borrowers telling their stories. If you look back to a decade ago, to 2012, I think almost no one would have predicted that we would be where we are today, with student debt payments and interest having been paused for 2 years and leading policymakers like Senate Majority Leader Schumer and Secretary King courageously calling almost daily for broad debt cancellation. I don't even think members of the Debt Collective, one of the earliest organized supporters of debt cancellation, would have predicted this. The Debt Collective was founded by borrowers and artists and educators after Occupy Wall Street. And while I don't think they would have predicted how policymakers have backed debt cancellation to the extent they have, they did make one very good prediction. And that's writing in 2012 in their debt resistors manual, they said, we've got to start by telling our stories and our truths. And here's part of what they wrote that I thought was so powerful. They wrote, because there is so much shame, frustration, and fear surrounding our debt, we seldom talk about it openly with others. An initial step in building a debt resistance movement involves sharing the myriad ways that debt affects us both directly and indirectly. So empowering borrowers to tell their truth is also the mission for which Natalia Abrams founded the Student Debt Crisis Center that's hosting us today. And I remember I first met Natalia in 2013 at a meeting of policy groups and educator labor unions. And I still remember Natalia saying then that ending the student debt crisis had to start with borrowers connecting with each other and telling their stories. So that was the first crucial thing, borrowers telling their stories to each other. But the second thing was that borrowers started talking to other important allies about their struggles, including researchers like me and Louise and policymakers like Secretary King. And this got folks like us and the media to start questioning that dominant narrative that student loans are a ticket to opportunity. And looking back, we can see that a key turning point is something that Secretary King already mentioned. It was when defrauded for-profit college students started to get their stories heard. There had been a major report by the US Senate on predatory for-profit colleges in 2010. But even that didn't make the same impact as when over 100 for-profit college students launched their debt strike in 2015. And that debt strike gave them a platform to tell their story. The student debt advocate Alexis Goldstein worked at that time with the ranking US House Finance Committee representative Maxine Waters to organize a briefing for congressional representatives and staff. And they gave borrowers a chance to tell policymakers directly how the borrowers had done everything right. They borrowed using federal loans like they were told to. They showed up for class and they were promised they'd end up with jobs that would pay more than enough to repay their debts. But as we know, that wasn't true. And like many of us, these students were left with debts that continued to grow from interest even after their colleges collapsed. And after these briefings where students and borrowers told their stories, congressional staff told Alexis that hearing directly from borrowers had been critical for them to understand how student loans were a trap for a huge class of borrowers, not a resource for opportunity. So that's that second crucial thing. And that third and final crucial thing was that borrower advocates working with other groups like researchers and policymakers built this new narrative, not just for why, but also how we cancel student debt. And again, that for-profit college crackdown that Secretary King helped lead was really part of what got the ball rolling. Legal experts and policymakers like Senator Warren responded to borrower stories in 2014 by identifying how federal law could be used to cancel debts for hundreds of thousands of for-profit college students with a program called Borrower Defense. Within less than a year of Secretary King's Senate confirmation in 2016, the department figured out how to implement that borrower defense and canceled debts for almost 50,000 for-profit college borrowers. Hundreds of thousands of others likely would have received debt cancellation if Donald Trump hadn't won the 2017 election or the election in 2016. But that really set the seed. And we've since had an expansion of the idea to cancel debt broadly using some of those same policy tools that were developed around the for-profit college debt cancellation push. And that got a big boost in 2019 when Senator Warren, our keynote later today, became the first senator to propose broad debt cancellation. And she worked with researchers like folks at the Harvard Predatory Student Lending Center to propose that to render the legal explanation for how we could use executive authority to do this broadly. So it wasn't one group of folks who made all this happen. It was different people coming together, contributing different expertise, and folks, like Louise said, where we reconsidered our expertise when we heard the truths of borrowers that didn't fit what we thought we already knew that was right. And I think that's the same thing that we're going to have to do to get debt cancellation over the finish line and to build a debt-free higher education system.
Charlie, I think our audience today is as inspired as I am. I tend to get alerts when we get new testimonials sent through our site, and we are getting a ton right now. So folks are hearing what you're saying about the history of student debt reform. And I want to underline what you said, because I was thinking about it and I'm glad you touched on it. Hearing you piece together everything that's happened over the years, it is very hard when you're a borrower and you're struggling, or if you're an advocate and you're fighting nonstop, to really recognize that it took a cast of so many people and so many different initiatives to get where we are today. And for me, it was really I was able to enjoy hearing you connect the dots, because I remember working on for-profit college reform and all these other issues that were critically important at the time, and now are in the rearview mirror because we've pushed this movement so far. So that was great. Thank you so much, Charlie. All right, great. I want to keep this conversation going. I want to get back to Secretary King, who's with us, back to the topic about data. Secretary King, the government and government agencies have in some ways more data than any other institution. And I'm just curious to know, in your experience as education secretary, how was data helpful to your work? And where were there maybe roadblocks where you didn't have the right data or couldn't use data to really inform the work that you and the department were doing?
Sure, it's such an important question. I think one of the things that drove our attention to the for-profit sector was looking at the data on completion, employment, and defaults. And what we could see is that the for-profit sector had worse outcomes for students, and that there were a set of predatory institutions that really were a sham. And so we mobilized to try to take those institutions on and to make the students whole. Data were critical to that decision. We tried in the Obama administration to push towards greater transparency from higher ed institutions around outcomes, graduation rates, employment. We created something called the College Scorecard so that students could see what the outcomes were for different institutions. We didn't at that time have program level data, which are really important so that students can understand the specifics of outcomes by program at the institution they may attend. But I guess what I would say is I worry that as a country, we have not focused necessarily on the right data. So for example, I talked about our hopes for income-driven repayment. Well, income-driven repayment hasn't really budged the default rates. I mean, we're still looking at a quarter of borrowers defaulting within 12 years. And that number is around half for Black student borrowers. We know also that of that $1.8 trillion of debt I described, 2/3 is held by women. So this is a gender equity issue, it's a racial equity issue, but more than that, it's a societal issue. We haven't focused as a society on the way in which the student loan system is not delivering on the goal, which is for higher education to be a pathway to opportunity for all Americans. That's the fundamental data point that we seem to be ignoring as a country. This is a moment, hopefully, where we change that.
Luis, I know when we were preparing for this panel, you had some thoughts about where there were areas where no data existed or there wasn't the right kind of data either. So I wonder if you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate that the work the Department of Education has done under especially Obama's tenure and Secretary King's to think about what scorecards we needed to be tracking data and making statistics available. And I'm a different kind of researcher, so I don't spend a ton of time working with statistics, which makes me more oriented towards thinking about what we don't know or what we can't say. And it partly comes from me asking, well, can we know this? Can we know this? And they say, no, there's no data on that. And so then I tend to say, well, why not? And then kind of follow that thread. And speaking of what Charlie said about starting with borrower stories, like one of the things that's really bothered me in the past couple of years as I pursued these questions is not being able to go from borrowers' testimonials of they took out $60,000, they've been paying for 20 years, they now owe $80,000 or $150,000, and how did that happen? And that we can't actually, so I started asking, well, how would we track that? How do we figure out how much someone has paid versus how much they owed originally and how much they owe now? And I was very shocked to find out there wasn't really a way to do that. And so like that seems, like a very big problem on a lot of fronts, including, like kind of violating some of the basic tenets of what we think about like a debt holding relationship between a borrower and a debt holder, that they can't document how much they've received from you over this time. And so I've been kind of taking some ethical stances along those lines to then, if we can't demonstrate this large scale, then I want to start from believing borrowers until we have that national level data and really pressuring whether that's people who can help me try and figure it out at the in positions of power, or people who can help me try and triangulate to figure this out. But I think this is like, these are, figuring out what we don't know is really important to understanding the system as a whole. And I think we saw in the past couple of weeks how much what we don't know matters when the NPR report about IDR, how the IDR program was working, in that it turned out that loan servicers in many cases were not actually even tracking borrowers' progress towards getting loan forgiveness. How many of them had, how many qualifying payments they had. And this kind of manifested some of our worst fears about whether the IDR program is actually going to work to cancel people's debt who originally enrolled in it, or whether it's just a way to lower your payments at the cost of having a rising balance, which circles back to the original issue that I mentioned about borrowers having increasing balances. And so I think working to define the problem in my world, which is very essential to being able to come up with a solution, means working together to kind of piece together what don't we know and why don't we know it, to then and work that around to how can we understand what's wrong with the system itself if the system does not know these things about itself either. Because how are they going to be expected to do something like fix IDR if they weren't tracking people's progress towards IDR forgiveness? So that's what I am working with now, that we sometimes do reach the edge of what we can just tally up easily.
I'm the only person on this panel. Well, I'm, other than maybe Secretary King, I am an advocate, not a researcher. So I'm going to put my advocate hat on for 1 second. And I just want to flag, Louise just said, she was listening to borrowers. And I think every single person who's spoken today already has said that borrower voices and stories has driven their work. Whether you're Senator Schumer, whether you're an advocate or a researcher, people sharing their experiences has driven so much of this work. And I know our goal at putting this event together is to remind our supporters and people across the country that their voices do matter and that there are, in fact, people working in every capacity to address this problem. Because we hear, and we had heard for years, people feel like nobody was listening. That absolutely is not the case. So thank you, Louise, for saying that. And thanks for everyone else for also highlighting borrower stories. Charlie, I want to go back to you with a similar question about where our limitations are. But I'm going to flip it on its head. I'm curious to know if there's any area of research that you think we need to explore further. What is it? And maybe what would we learn from that if we could in fact explore it further?
Yeah, I think, one area that we need to explore further is the extent to which folks who have negative net worth from student debt are impeded from accumulating household wealth. Everything that borrowers say says, yes, that is the case. When you listen to borrowers, and it makes sense, they say, look, I've got more debt than household wealth. I can't get a home loan. I can't get a car loan. I don't have the flexibility to get the best job I can to increase my income. It's a real, it makes it impossible for me to accumulate wealth. There was a recent study that showed baby boomers in 1989 had 7 times the household wealth that millennials of the same age today have. And obviously there's big racial implications for having an entire generation of people, as more Black Americans have started going to college, to then require that folks take on huge amounts of debt to go to college, has major racial implications when we paid for a much whiter generation to go to college starting in the 60s debt-free. So I think that's one area of research. Another area of research is, I think people don't quite realize just how fiscally affordable it is to cancel student debt. And the main reason is rather simple. It's that borrowers are not able to repay their debts. And so the debts are not actually worth what their face value outstanding balance is. We all know the $1.8 trillion number, but one recent Department of Education study that used 2 outside consulting firms found that really only 62% of the interest and or 62% of that outstanding balance would ever be repaid, meaning canceling debt delivers huge relief to borrowers now, but it doesn't sacrifice a tremendous amount of future revenue. And we've learned that we can do it fiscally because of the student loan pause, via which we've effectively canceled $100 billion of interest in the last 2 years. So I think those are two things where we need to get more precise. But they're instances where borrowers have told us some truths that we need to figure out how do we validate those truths and apply them to changing policy.
Secretary King, I see you shaking your head in agreement. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I just think this point that so much of the debt won't come back to the federal government. The reality is people are set up to fail in a way where they are likely to default. So this really is a question of how do we as a society right a wrong of the last 40 years and try to repair the harm. I do think one of the things we should address is a kind of false narrative that addressing the harm is somehow regressive and only going to benefit those at the top. You know, and the Roosevelt Institute has done great work on this. It is very clear that canceling debt for borrowers actually primarily benefits middle-income folks and working class folks. It's a relatively small percentage of the cancellation of debt that would benefit the wealthiest because the wealthiest don't borrow. The student loan system is used by working class and middle income folks and low income folks. It's not really used by the wealthiest because they have their wealth to cover the cost of school. So exploding that myth, I think, is really important to moving this conversation forward.
I'm glad you brought up the progressive angle. Charlie, you certainly have been a part of the team of researchers and authors writing about that. Do you want to jump in, and Luis as well, if you've got thoughts about the progressive piece, please?
Yeah, well, and our starting off point was Louise's work, but we tried to use some of the same data that Louise's team has used to study this issue. And as Secretary King said, we found that it's, the highest wealth borrowers or the highest wealth individuals really have almost no student debt at all. Whereas folks who come from low wealth backgrounds borrow much more and they remain in debt much more. And I think one additional facet of this is that if you've got low wealth to start with, you're going to borrow more. But then if you have debt on your books, it's going to be harder to build wealth. And so Secretary King said it's actually middle income folks. That's absolutely true. But also among middle income folks, Black households borrow much more among middle income folks than white middle income folks, because white middle income folks tend to have higher household wealth because of racial exclusion from homeownership. And via the mechanisms that Louise talked about earlier. So like Secretary King said, it is progressive to cancel student debt, and it rights these historical wrongs that are compounded by our student debt system.
Yeah, I could add on to that. I will say I don't think that the argument that cancellation is regressive is made in good faith. They're comparing it firstly to cancellation after 20 to 25 years under IDR, which, as we were addressing, is being revealed to not work. So, if IDR worked, then it would be fair potentially to make this comparison, but it's not. So we have to compare it to the system that we have, not the one we wish it was. But what I've also, the facts don't bear that out either, as both Secretary King and Charlie have just laid out. On top of that, I think we need to compare student loan cancellation to the student loan system that we have. And that is regressive in that we are currently asking marginalized people to pay more, like upfront, and taking out more debt that stays with them for much longer based on their lower wealth and lower income, that they get lower returns on. They're less likely to graduate due in large part to these economic stressors. And then they get less return in terms of income because of gender and racial labor market discrimination. So they get less for and spend more for it, and this debt is much more likely to stay with people the more marginalized they are. Like that is the definition of a regressive system, and I think that, you know, I would prefer that we talk about I think that we can't talk about regressivity without taking that into account. Yeah.
All right, folks are coming and going through this live stream since it's going to be running throughout the day. So for folks who just joined on, we are speaking with former Education Secretary John King and some of the leading thought leaders in the space of student debt, Charlie Eaton and Louise Seamster. Louise, when I was a student, I leaned on some of your research in some essays that I wrote, and I really connected with a term that you coined, predatory inclusion. And if I understand this correctly, you know, lenders offer these services to marginalized students as a way to access economic opportunities. But the harm caused by these services themselves nearly strips away all of the benefits of an education. And that put a light bulb in my head that right when America was really starting to realize the dream of a higher education system for all, we created this quicksand that was harming the people that needed it most. So I'm curious, can you talk about what predatory inclusion is and how it relates to higher education and student loan debt?
Sure. Yes, it's quite a coincidence that right at the same time that Black students and women had been fighting for entry into these public institutions of higher education, the terms of entry, the cost of entry, immediately started to increase, such that suddenly what had been seen as a public good and something that people could access with very low to no investment suddenly became a thing that people needed to take on that investment themselves. They needed to place a bet on their own future, and rather than seeing it as a collective public good, but for a smaller group of people who had access to it, in fact, then suddenly the whole meaning of higher education shifted and the terms in which people access it, such that it can be a really uphill battle to talk with people when they say, well, why should I pay for someone to go to college? It's like, well, do you like having someone who can treat you when you come into the hospital? Like, we're not going to get there otherwise. Like, we've lost our sense of what benefits higher education has to us, and even graduate education, which can sometimes be a thing people avoid. But like, we need doctors, you know, no matter how they are paid, to have a functioning society. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing that with teachers as well. And so we coined predatory inclusion, looking at the data that we could see and trying to understand why this rise in Black student debt especially looked so much like the rise in subprime mortgages that had immediately preceded it and leading up to the Great Recession, and in part triggering it. And that was demonstrated to be about banks looking at the, you know, how to monetize the idea and dream of equality through homeownership and turn that into their personal gain. And so we staked a claim that we saw a similar thing happening in higher ed, and through, in large part, through those for-profit institutions that Secretary King was fighting. But scholars like Tressie McMillan Cottom, in her amazing book Lower Ed, warned that for-profit institutions were just more effective at manipulating and profiting from inequality, and that it was easy to foresee other institutions doing the same thing. And I worry that we are seeing, as we've shifted to the model of using student tuition revenue as the main source of profit for even public institutions, that we do see a similar turn and shift to how much can we get out of students when we've moved very far away from the idea of education as a public good. So it's really not just about how much students have to pay, but the idea that students should have to pay at all for a public service.
I too, I think, am one of those wacky people that wants the doctors at the hospital to be educated and know what they're doing. So, you know, feel free to drop in the chat if you also want an educated workforce that's skillful at what they do. All right, I'm going to go back to Secretary King here. Secretary, you are currently the president of another ally organization of ours, the Education Trust. And some of the work that the Education Trust has done that's really been leading in this space has explored what the student debt crisis is for Black borrowers in particularly. And I want to quote something that your organization highlights online, which is, any solution to the Black student debt crisis must not only address the immediate needs of those with existing debt, but should also help future generations of Black students complete college without a crushing debt. And our organization, we see this as a two-sided coin. We have to address currently existing student loan debt, and we also have to make a system in which people aren't crushed by debt in the first place. So I'm curious to know, what solutions are there to make sure that these future generations don't face their own student debt crisis?
Yeah, it's such an important point. So look, it goes to really the heart of what Louise was just saying about seeing higher education as a public good. If we saw higher education as a public good, we would have the federal government partner with state governments to invest in public higher ed institutions the way they were pre-1980. So part of this is correcting the policy mistake of the last 40 years. If we invested in public higher ed institutions, they would have the resources to provide an affordable education that's debt-free. We also should at least double Pell Grants. I mentioned that Pell Grants used to account for 80% of the cost of college. Now it's less than a third. Doubling Pell Grants would be a good start. You can make an argument really they need to be tripled to get back to the purchasing power that they had in 1980. But that would allow folks to have the support they need to get through college debt-free. We also, I think, need to make a very significant investment in our historically Black colleges and universities, and our Hispanic serving institutions, and our institutions that are focused on Native American students. These are institutions that have been underinvested in, not just for decades, but for generations. And we ought to invest in those institutions. That is how we will ensure the diverse future workforce that we need. And then, President Biden has talked about making community college tuition free. This has been a focus of Dr. Biden for sure throughout her time when she was second lady and now as first lady. That would be very helpful. Community college is where many students begin their college experience. It's also a place where folks can go back and get additional skills for the workforce. But all of this comes down to, do we believe that higher education is beneficial to the society as a whole? And if we do, then we ought to invest in it. That's how we prevent being right back in this space again, even if we cancel student debt.
Charlie, Luis, I'm not sure if you've explored these topics as well, but if you've got any thoughts about how we address the other side of this issue, which is college affordability, I'm happy to bring you in as well.
Yeah, the only thing I would add here is, we put out a report recently called Creditor Colleges about these institutional student debts that students have taken on during COVID and prior to COVID, where there's misalignments between how we deliver our financial aid system. And if a student withdraws, they end up having to repay their Pell Grant. And this is kind of an example, I think, that actually gets to this deep point that both Louise and Secretary King have made about how thinking about higher education as a public good and delivering it as a public good rather than something that people need to pay for leads us to deliver and pay for higher education in a different way. And so one way we could change how we pay for higher education is not just to fund more for higher education, but to do less to police students once we give them a Pell Grant or give them a student loan, to make sure that they're using it, because that just creates administrative burdens for the student and for the schools and for the Department of Education to monitor these funds in a way that makes it harder for students to just stay focused on getting a degree. And ultimately, the value of the student getting the degree, that's what's going to lead them to succeed, not us making sure that they showed up for every class in order to get their Pell Grant eligibility. So I think this is, this deep idea of returning to thinking about higher education as a public good that benefits everyone and that delivers so much benefit to the student that the student is going to use our resources wisely if we give them the resources.
I would just add briefly onto that I've been thinking about like ways to rank our different options, and whether it's tuition-free college or debt-free college, or how much you increase Pell Grants or other things. And so trying to think of like a guideline for me and maybe others to use for like, what, if all these options are better, then what's more better. So in my mind, if we are getting towards away from students as revenue generators for institutions and towards the idea of education for public good, there are ways we can think about how that is reflected in the structure of how we fund these systems. So the more that we fund the institution, like the public university I am at right now, regardless of, and not tie all the funding to the individual student who attends, that we will build up the sense of supporting a robustly funded public university, and then students can come in and out as they wish. But I think that actually, like, that helps kind of reflect the philosophy of what we're trying to push towards, and away from both the predatory structures that can target students for the money that comes with them, whether that's a Pell Grant or a federal student loan or the GI Bill, like for-profits were caught doing, targeting veterans. If we get away from those incentive structures that for exploitative models, and towards just funding institutions, so we are not in constant crisis with our budgets, so that they don't have to like run around chasing students like the way we are doing, trying to steal them from other states so we can get the higher out-of-state tuition, but instead like thinking about how we build up our programs now that they're adequately funded for once. I think that we can actually solve a lot of problems at one time by trying to rework what we're funding when we are funding higher ed.
That whole conversation about public funding, I think, could fill up an entire other day of panels, and maybe we'll explore that next time because it's really important. All right, I'm looking at the clock. We will do kind of a round of closing thoughts here in just a minute, but before then, Luis and Charlie, I want to keep it with you, both just to kind of summarize today's topic. We're talking about combining research and advocacy. Both of you have had research that has been utilized by lawmakers and advocates to address the student debt crisis. So I wonder if you have just any final thoughts on why data is a powerful tool for social movements, and maybe share some personal perspectives on how your work has helped policymakers in this movement.
You want one of us to go first?
Yeah, Charlie, you're here. Go ahead, start us off.
Sure. Yeah, I think often, we use data to keep track of what people are doing. And like I was saying, I think putting more trust in students and more trust in institutions when we fund them, making our higher education system funding simpler is a way to make it work better. Who among us has not talked to somebody who doesn't know how to navigate the FAFSA and their financial aid applications? But we can use all that data that has been gathered to triangulate, is a word that W.E.B. Du Bois, the great Black sociologist, actually, I don't know if he used that word, but it's certainly a method that he used to connect qualitative data about people's lived experiences, the stories that people tell for themselves, and then think at a bigger scale. How do we zoom out from people's individual lives, where we see important parts of the system that get lost in the big picture, and then zoom out and see how our own experiences with student debt connects to the experiences of others. And so data can help us to do that, to see how does my experience with student debt, how does my experience in the higher education system, how am I not alone in that experience? How do others experience it similarly or differently? And that's can be a powerful tool for understanding inequities and paths to equity. And so that's what we try to do at our Higher Education Race in the Economy Lab, in building large data sets on student debt, on higher education, and on racial inequality and some of these dimensions of higher education equity that we have not attended to over the last 40 years.
I would just add, it's been really interesting and exciting to get to work as a researcher on stuff we don't usually get to do, which is, we have an immediate question. We want to know how to rate this policy. Can you help us use all your information and background to make a policy recommendation? But right now, and that's not usually how researchers work. We work slowly and think and have a long process of publishing. And so getting over that hump to not just making policy recommendations as a throwaway, like I used to say that kind of at the end of panels when they're like, what do we do about this problem? And I'd say, cancel student debt. And I didn't think that I'd be in a position within a year to try and make that happen. So I am grateful to the fact that having pursued higher ed and working in it put me in the position where I could do this. And I do think that we have enough, having been part of this giant shift in how we even understand what's going on, and how to fix it has been really important to me. And I think that it shows me how much more we could do to really change how we understand higher ed. And that's why I'm talking, we've all been talking about education as a public good as part of this kind of sea change in not just in erasing a certain amount of debt, but the bigger push that needs to take place in order to make that not just understandable, but inevitable.
All right, I see folks are joining in for our next panel, which is great news. So I'm just going to wrap this up. I want to give each of you an opportunity to just provide some final thoughts. So Secretary King, as someone who's dedicated their life to public service, I know you are optimistic about the road ahead, as am I. So can you tell our audience, what is your vision for the future of higher education, and what can folks in the audience today do to help end the student debt crisis?
Sure. So first of all, just thank you for this panel and for this opportunity. And it's been great to be in conversation with you and with Louise and Charlie. Look, first, we have to put pressure on folks to make sure that President Biden follows through on what he talked about during the campaign and cancel student debt. We need to make sure that there's debt cancellation for all borrowers. That's one. Two, we need to make sure that we elect members of Congress who are committed to a vision of debt-free college and the kind of investment in public, in higher education as a public good, and particularly public education institutions that we need to achieve a healthier society. And then third, and this is really important, we also have to step back and think about what kind of society do we want to be. 1 out of 5 college students is a parent. If we don't have universal affordable childcare, folks are going to struggle to take advantage of higher education. We have a society where we don't treat healthcare as a human right. So there are people who are enrolled in higher education institutions and they can't get healthcare, so they're not able to complete their education. So we really have to step back and ask, what's the future society we want to build? And to me, it's one where education is a path to opportunity and where justice is available to everyone.
Thank you, Secretary. We really appreciate you being here today. I know I'm hearing from folks in the chat that are happy to hear a new voice and really a passionate voice on this issue. Luis, I'm going to go to you for a closing thought here. You're a tireless researcher and explorer of this topic, and we all owe a debt of gratitude to you for the work that you've done so far. So thank you for that. But can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming work and maybe how we can follow you and the projects that you have coming down the pike?
Sure. Well, I'm going to keep writing about debt for the foreseeable future. I have a couple more articles contracted through Brookings, so you can watch out for blog posts there. I'm thinking about debt more broadly these days too, about and how that interacts with wealth. Like the idea, we have so much stake in wealth because we have disinvested in our social safety net more broadly. Because you have to earn as much as you can and build as much wealth in your home as you can before you retire to hope that you have a roof over your head when you die. And like we could, just in the same way that we can rethink higher ed, we can rethink why we've put all our chips on higher ed as the key to economic mobility, and how we could actually build out a lot of supports that don't rely on debt structures to make our lives easier. And then within that, sounds a bit out of left field, but my book manuscript is actually on how debt structures lie at the heart of the Flint water crisis, and to try and show more about these debt relationships at the municipal level, and how these same problems that you all are experiencing as borrowers actually apply to cities as well. They have real, as they have real concrete life and death stakes.
Great. And Charlie, your last up here, I know your research is ongoing as well, but you just launched your book, Bankers in the Ivory Tower. So where can folks go to learn more about your writing and follow your work as well?
Yeah, well, folks can get the book on Amazon, or if you want a 20% discount, you can get it at the University of Chicago Press website with the discount code EATON20. That's my last name, 20. And, the kind of where a big part of my research is about how changes in our larger financial system are highly connected to our changes in our higher education financing system. And we've talked a lot about reinvesting in public universities and restoring public universities and other things as important public goods. And one thing that has traced the disinvestment in public higher education and other important social programs is changes in our tax structure, where we deregulated financial markets, and we also reduced taxes that are paid particularly on big Wall Street firms in private equity and hedge funds. Our last keynote today is Senator Warren. It's not a coincidence that Senator Warren was an early leader on debt cancellation and has been a leader on proposing a wealth tax and restoring taxes on Wall Street and on private equity and hedge funds. And so my research will continue to explore the connections to how do we make sure that finance is serving the economy and the people, not extracting wealth and not paying its fair share in taxes, so that we can pay for things like higher education and for the social goods that we need to thrive as a society.
All right. Well, thank you to all three of our panelists, Secretary John B. King, Charlie Eaton, and Louise Seamster. It has really been an enlightening conversation, and let's continue to fight together. For our audience members, we are moving into our next panel, so stay with us. We still have several hours more to go. And with that, I'm going to just get us started here with a quick introduction to our next panel.
I know what it is to lie awake at night, panic over student loan and default, despite working 12-hour days. All people who call this nation home deserve the freedom to build a full life, to pursue their unique gifts and contribute to every sector of our economy. We have to take bold action to address the inequities and disparities in our country and use every tool available to provide our communities with the critical relief they so desperately need.
It's a way to help close the racial wealth gap. It's a way to help close the gender gap. Women now carry 2/3 of all student loan debt. And by the way, Black women are the single biggest, they are carrying the biggest debt load of any group.
This past month, the Student Debt Crisis Center shared stories of female borrowers working to end the burden of student debt. Despite hard work and aspirations, it is fundamentally harder for women borrowers to afford their monthly payments and rise above this debt, no matter how educated or experienced they are. Our next panel dives into this trillion-dollar crisis, featuring the Executive Director of the United States of Women, Jordan Brooks, President of the Student Debt Crisis Center, Natalia Abrams, and the National Press Secretary of Next Gen America, Christy Johnson, who is filling in for Christina Tinson Ramirez, who unfortunately had their flight delayed. Also joining us is the Legislative Manager and Policy Advisor at Next Gen Policy, Samantha Singh. And moderating this panel is Arthi Swaminathan, a reporter at Yahoo Finance. Arthi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vivek, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Hello to all the panelists. So nice to see every one of you. So I want to start with a very broad sort of question that one of you can answer, which is, when we think about $1.7 trillion in student loan debt, that is mostly being held by women like us, right? So can you speak a little bit as to why we need to draw more attention to this? And also, how does that debt affect women at a very high level? Maybe we can start with Jordan.
Sure. Thanks, Arthi, and thanks everyone for having me. It's an honor to be here with all of you. So we all know that student debt is disproportionately holding women back from financial success, from economic stability. Women are often unable to cover bills or important expenses, have to delay life plans like buying a home or starting a business. And so we really, really aren't growing an economy that works for everyone if we still continue to have the student loan debt that is holding 51% of America back. And it's really debilitating women financially and emotionally. Someone in the chat mentioned mental health. It is continuing to contribute to financial stress, continuing to contribute to health issues for women and girls across the country. And so, it is holding women back in a whole host of ways that we need to make sure we are removing those barriers in order to have this country grow and have women be able to thrive economically.
Christy, really like to share your thoughts.
Hi, thanks for having me. Christina sends her apologies. She had a flight delayed today, so y'all get me instead. But yeah, I love everything Jordan just said. I think, what really the student debt crisis is a woman's issue. Exposes where our economy is stacked against women, people of color, young women of color specifically. At Next Gen America, where we're leading the biggest youth vote mobilization in the country and happened for the last few years, we're talking to young people every single day who are saying this is their top issue. And at Next Gen, where we're trying to advance these issues, where we're advocating, for things like student debt, we're looking at what is the future of this country, and it's women. And if they're being held back by debt, and once they are graduating from college, not making the same as men, making tens of thousands of dollars less than men, there's no way for women to get ahead in this country without this cancellation. So super happy to be here and talking about this issue, and I'll pass it back.
Samantha, Natalia, one of you.
Yeah, thank you, Arthi, for moderating this panel. And thank you. I just see that we have new people joining us. You're joining our State of Student Debt Summit, and we are talking about women in student debt. And women, we know, hold 2/3 of student loan debt. That was just in the video. And that's $1 trillion, over $1 trillion of the $1.7 trillion number is held by women. And we know women, on average go to school more than men. But as Christy just said, they make less, and in fact, were the most impacted during the pandemic by not going to work, staying home to take care of children, the family members. So we see this crisis for the student debt crisis for women specifically expanding, and COVID just shined a big bright light on it, and we have to take care of it now.
Yeah, and I'm happy to add, thanks for having me here. At Next Gen Policy, we do fight for progressive policy changes across the spectrum for economic inequality, social justice, racial justice, combating climate change. And across the board, at every crisis, women are the ones that are carrying the biggest burden of this. And, talking about economic crisis, this is It highlights the wealth gap that women have always had to take on, and especially for women of color, that does not, generally don't have a lot of generational wealth, so to speak, especially first generation women like myself, having an extra burden like this on top of everything else that we're shouldering, just puts us at a greater disadvantage. And that does hold us back from economic prosperity and, reaching the kind of American dream here. So it is a crisis that is well worth taking a hard focus on.
Thank you, all of you. And I see in the comments a lot of personal stories being shared, and we will address those topics one by one. But let us start with what is a deceptively simple question, which is, why do women take on more debt? We go to the same schools, a lot of us do the same degrees, but why do we end up taking on more debt? Can one of you help me understand why this is happening?
I'll just start off kind of where I left off there. Again, just my personal story, a first generation college student, not a lot of generational wealth here. I'm proud daughter of immigrant parents. We had to start from scratch to get in order for myself and my brother to go to college. So we're already at a disadvantage than many other families here. And so taking a look at our finances and coming up with different ways to make that difference. I'm already kind of behind the ball, so to speak. And then after graduation, there is, the racial kind of bias out in the workplace. And we know that women do not earn the full dollar amount as our male counterparts. And then it's even less so for our women of color, earning less on the dollar than our white counterparts as well. So, there's all these things that are always compounding on each other. And just because a student has graduated from college, it doesn't mean that all the problems beforehand has suddenly disappeared. So this is, the burdens of, helping, or just, what we have to face and carry as women, that we take on as caretakers in our families, supporting the next, generation here, that all compounds itself so that by the time, we're in our careers, we are behind the ball, and then if you're choosing to take on a family of your own, that is an extra, economic cost as well. I mean, yes, all the positive things from that and family, but, when it comes down to the dollar amounts, that is another financial burden that women will face uniquely on their own, a loss of income, if they get paid time leave as well. So all that, again, just compounds itself. And so unfortunately, we are still the ones stuck in this situation uniquely because of being women.
And, I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat that we know that this affects women of all ages. So many older Americans and older women during the Great Recession, we were told, go back to school, get a new degree, find a new certificate. Because remember, not everyone with student debt actually has a degree. They may have gone to classes or gotten a certificate. And so that just expounded. And I also think women, especially women of color, feel the need and frankly have to get higher level degrees just to get paid as their counterparts male counterparts that may just have a high school or college degree versus graduate degree. So we see that wealth just expand with higher levels of education.
And one more point too, just that our traditional work and roles are not valued at the same amount. And so caretaking, preschool, teaching, all of those roles that, are not paid or seen as something that should be paid sometimes, right, is also a huge issue when we're trying to pay off student loans.
We will return to that topic after this question, but we often hear, and I've often reported that women of color, Black women especially, hold a lot more debt and they really struggle to pay it off. The outcomes, the numbers don't look fabulous, right? So why is it that, they graduate with about $38,000 more in debt than, women of other color, women like white women? And also, how does this exacerbate racial and gender inequality? We hear this conversation going on, but can you just speak to your thoughts on it? And maybe we can start another way. Or you can start with Jordan.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Samantha talked about it a lot when she mentioned this a minute ago. You know, often women of color are coming into college with less financial support from their families, have to rely really heavily on student loans to cover their tuition. And then again, once we graduate, there is a significant gender pay gap that exists across this country for a whole host of reasons, both in terms of, institutional segregation of jobs and roles, and also because there is just a really serious bias against women in the workforce in many ways still in terms of the generational institutional gender pay gap. And so, for Black women particularly, there is an additional sort of threshold, I feel like, that frequently there's a ton of bias against right now. And also we know that Black women are also going to colleges and enrolling and finishing and continuing to go to graduate degrees at really high rates as well. So it is all of these things wrapped up together.
One of the things I'm seeing in the comments is, single moms and widowed moms and how they are dealing with debt. And I'm a new mom. I cannot imagine paying debt and also, like you talked about taking care of a child. It's a full-time job, taking care of 2 children. I cannot imagine how you do it. Kudos to all the moms out there. But can we speak to a little bit too about, having dependents, paying for them on top of going to college, paying for college, graduating, finding a job? How do all these costs, and they're not really costs, but emotional costs, right? How do these all add up together? And how can campuses address this? How can employers address this?
Well, I'll let someone else address the campus and employer part, but I always think of my friend Olivia, who is African-American, and, just my counterpart, we're the same age, and I don't have children, she does. And I didn't have to get a graduate degree to have my job, she did. And she fell into default because she had the choice of paying for medication for her children and paying for basic needs and necessities like food for her children, which led her to student loan default. I was able to pay my loans off in 10 years. I'm one of the lucky ones. I also borrowed very little, but because of that, I just see those impacts of having, both being a woman of color, but then having children. And of course, you put your children first. And no one should have to make that decision of whether to pay for a child's medication or to pay for student debt.
Christy, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about is exactly right. It creates a vicious cycle for women who, are enrolling at colleges at a higher rate than men, and then going and then taking on more debt and then not getting paid, the same amount. But it's, entirely, it's a moral issue in this country. There's no reason that college should be this expensive. It really is exposing the cracks in our system for women who are trying to get ahead. Higher education should not be just for the rich. It should be for everybody in this country. So that's the only way, forward, I think, is to really break this cycle. And that starts with student debt cancellation. What young people are looking at right now, and what they're really in tune about, especially with the upcoming election, is the promises that were made on the campaign trail by Biden. I think that since there's been no cancellation at all, a big promise that was made on his campaign, it's really going to be an indication of if they're going to stay involved in the political process or not. So I think that's what's big for young people right now, is really making sure that we get this cancellation as soon as we can. It's really, really breaking a lot of, what we were just saying before, a lot of people's ability to buy a house, to invest, or even to buy food for themselves, to buy basic needs. It's really holding back an entire generation of young people, and it's really, really necessary that we get that cancellation now.
So student loan payments have been paused for 2 years. That's about $400 that women, actually everyone is saving, but for women, I guess feels different, right? And I'm seeing a lot of women take on higher and higher degrees, more advanced degrees, PhDs, because they want to get a good job. They want to get a good outcome, right? They want to provide for their kids. And also, I'm also seeing women feel like in the comments, like feeling this need to take on a higher financial burden when their spouse is not out of work, or during COVID we had a lot of these impacts. So, can you speak to all panelists? Can you speak a little to this responsibility that we've taken on as women, and also when the payment pause lifts, what happens? And can you speak to are we going to feel more anxiety, or how much pain are we going to feel? Just speak a little bit to that. Let's start with Jordan or Sam.
Yeah. I mean, every it's no surprise, right? Every dollar that someone has on hand makes a difference. There are tax policies like the child care income tax credit, and all those policies put dollars into the hands of families immediately. And we know that raises families and children out of poverty, and that means women, right, with these families and children. So having this payment pause has been a lifeline for borrowers throughout these past 2 years. The stress that was alleviated, just not being hounded about this debt that you kind of had to take on to better your life. Folks were enjoying life, having that less impact of stress and being able to pay for the daily necessities, not making those hard choices anymore, and kind of, yes, it's still back there, but you don't have it facing you every single day, which, having something like that on your mind, in your face every single day, will take a toll on you. And so when we talk about resuming payments without really addressing the systematic errors and problems plaguing the student loan system, and not even addressing the crisis that it is right now, and not canceling student debt before lifting this up, we are setting borrowers, women, to fail. Their circumstances only got worse, from losing jobs, maybe taking more care of family members who might have had health problems, a loss in the family, and that impact just emotionally and perhaps economically as well. I mean, things didn't get magically better for women during the payment pause either. So when you're going to turn these on and they don't have a better high paying job, we're not having pay equity right off the bat, like all these issues didn't go away. So you're just, turning on the floodgates for a systematic failure across the board here. And it's not going to be great for the economy, for our families at all. So it's not a good picture coming up here.
And look, pausing payments is not enough. You asked Arthi what is going to happen when payments resume. And the truth is they can't resume until we cancel student debt. That is the number one thing we're here for. We need to cancel as much debt as we possibly can, with the payment pause being extended. I think we're up to 6 times now. Each time we hear from borrowers, and especially women, that are so concerned about how to budget for the next year, how to plan for their family when they don't know what the decision will be 3 months each time. So we're really looking for that. We're seeing these comments. I see you, Kimberly, saying, this has been a blessing. We see you, Michelle and Denise. It's so important that we've had this, and I want to be grateful for the pause, but the pause is not policy, and we need real policy that is meaningful and lasting for all borrowers, not just women, but especially women, considering this is the panel.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add to that is, I think Samantha mentioned this, but the other problems didn't go away, and they're also not getting more solutions either. So we have bills that have stalled in Congress, the Build Back Better Act, which would have created more affordable childcare, which would have permanized the CTC, which would have helped create paid leave for women, so it's and men, so it's an equal playing field. all of these different things that actually would have created more economic stability for women across the country also aren't happening right now. And so if we continue to get to a space where we turn back on student loan payments, that's just going to be an additional exacerbation of the economic instability that women are facing in a time when, unfortunately, we are seeing increased prices and we are seeing inflation that is continuing to create additional monthly budgets that are considerably bigger. And so by adding an additional stressor to women, we're going to continue, and to all borrowers, to Natalia's point, like we are going to continue to see the economy not do as well, and people not do as well, and continue to see adverse health outcomes, adverse mental health outcomes, because people are going to be incredibly stressed by an increasingly shrinking budget.
Jordan, it's interesting. You mentioned a couple of things that we talk about at Yahoo Finance a lot: inflation, the R word, recession, gas prices. I mean, California, how expensive is gas? $6-7. Natalia, can you speak to, you guys did a survey recently about how these prices are sort of factoring into people's anxieties about paying off their student loans. So can you speak a little bit about maybe some stories that you're hearing about women who are considering this environment where you can't even get baby formula, like what, there's so many crises at once, right? Can you speak a little bit about the biggest one or two stories that you've heard? I think you're muted.
I'm muted. I'm in California, and yes, gas is almost $7 a gallon, and inflation is a very real thing. And borrowers, well, the stock market might be looking better, or real estate market might be looking better, the amount that we're paying for everyday necessities, for our gas, for our groceries, I think inflation rose 8% last month, and equivalent of I read somewhere 14% just this month. And did anyone get a 14% raise? No. So we're not getting enough money to be able to keep up. And I can't imagine if student loans had been turned on. And we hear from borrowers all the time. One that's on this chat right now, Vivian, who is saying, she should be a success story and has done a ton of work working with the homeless population and trying to give back, but is still trying to pay off her loans. And I just want to stress again, women are often the ones doing the budgeting for the family, often the ones worrying about the cost of goods. And without this clear guideline of where we're going, they're just so concerned and worried. And so we saw that in our survey, and we know that by canceling student debt, we will increase the overall GDP, we will increase the economy, and we will help women continue on and feel like their degree was worth it. I hate hearing when people feel that their degree or their education wasn't worth it because they're so saddled with debt. And we need to make sure that we can connect to that worth again.
Did anyone else want to weigh in? If not, I want to address this topic on parent plus loans. When we talk about canceling federal student loans, a lot of people write to me and say parent plus loans are not on the table, private loans are not on the table. A lot of these are like grandparents and taking out loans for the children, for the grandchildren. So how do you approach this topic, especially women who have to pay multiple student loan amounts, and especially private student loans? How would you speak with them, and how can as advocates encourage them to reach out and share some of their grievances, at least to get a load off their chest? Do we want to start? Jordan, you're smiling. Would you like to start?
Well, I was going to say, I feel like Natalia is the best expert on this. But I mean, I think the reality is we really need to address the cost of college, and we need to address the cost of the system as it is happening right now. This is not just the amount of debt that people are holding right now. It is the amount of debt that people are going to take on in the future. It is the entire system of predatory lending, and it is the entire system of also paying women not enough over the course of their careers to be able to pay off some of these loans. And so, I'm not necessarily an expert on the differences between all of the loans. And I think the student debt crisis team is probably better suited to answer that question. But the reality is, we need to address the entire system, and the entire system, which encourages parents and encourages grandparents to also take out these private loans to help their families, is really also very predatory and is going to continue to be exacerbated if we continue to live in the system that we are in right now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jordan, that it's always a two-pronged issue in my book. We have to take care of the cost of college, or we will be in a $2 trillion crisis yet again. And that's another unique thing, and not just for women and men, but with Parent Plus loans, we hear from so many people that are not only borrowing for themselves, they're now borrowing for their children. So you have multiple generations of loans in one family that they're trying to burden. And unfortunately, right now, the most generous repayment programs don't really apply, like public service loan forgiveness. It becomes much harder for those with Parent Plus loans to receive that relief. And I just want to be clear, when Senator Schumer or Senator Warren or Representative Presley talk about canceling student debt, we get this all the time. That includes Parent Plus loans. Parent Plus loans are student loans. And when we talk about student loans, we're talking about the entire federal system and not just the loans for young people in college. Because to the parents out there, we hear you. I wish, when I was younger, student loans were called college loans. I think it was intentional to make it student, to make it sound like it was this young person's issue only, when we know it's a multi-generational issue.
That segues into the next question that I had for Christy. We have, I guess, Next Gen America has spent a lot of time mobilizing millennials and young people. How do young people think about student loans? Is this a key voting issue? And because, young people have cost of college is really top of mind because of all these conversations that we're having. So what is happening on the ground from your perspective? And as we head into the midterms, how important is this going to be?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Student debt is at the top of the mind for young people. I would say it's the single most important issue to young people right now. And now more than ever, Biden needs to listen to us. He needs to give us a reason to believe in him. We're drowning in student debt right now. It's, we were talking about this as a women's issue. Absolutely. We really need to be putting into perspective, not just a gender issue, it's a racial justice issue. It's the time that we're in right now with the pandemic. I mean, it's left economic catastrophes across the board for so many young people. And, debt cancellation, it's not just, the thing that makes sense morally, it's really good economic sense. And I think that's something that, hasn't really been discussed at length in this conversation as a whole, as the student debt conversation as a whole, is this would stimulate the economy. It would put more money in the pockets of young people to spend on different parts of their lives and in effect stimulating the economy. But it's one of the biggest ways that we can also address the racial wealth gap as well. So, at Next Gen, we are hearing this every single day. We're doing what we can in a lot of different forms in terms of petitions, hosting town halls, putting as much pressure we can on the administration to see this cancellation. But to young people, it's going to be the issue that is driving them forward. It's going to be the issue that is at the forefront of their minds as they're heading to cast their ballot this election and for 2024 as well. So, we really, really need the administration to be listening to us in our call for this as we move forward.
So I just want to ask Sam a couple of questions. I'm in California, and California has done a lot on consumer protection. That's not to say other states have, but it is very visible what California is. And so you've done some work on this. Can you talk a little bit about what the state has done to help student debtors and how this could perhaps be a model on a federal level? What are some of the takeaways, the best takeaways, if you will?
Sure. Yeah. We were very, happy to work on leading the Student Borrower Bill of Rights, the first kind of far-reaching consumer protection bill across the nation here in California, in conjunction with a lot of the folks here on the summit and in the panel right now as supporters could not have done it without a wide coalition of multi-general advocates, AARP, others, that represent older borrowers were part of that coalition. And I mean, frankly, back when we first started that conversation, we were in a much different time, a different administration. So things federally were looking much different, kind of backing away from consumer protections at the CFPB, the Consumer Federal Protection Bureau, that would have done a lot of this kind of far-reaching support for borrowers. And so when we took a look at the landscape then, and even now, it still needs a lot of work, but student loan servicers and that entire industry, it was the wild, wild west. You would be surprised at how much there was nothing on the books to rein in this industry, make sure they were practicing, quality service and just kind of common sense standards. So, back then in many different states still, right, basic consumer protections that you would assume is applied to your student loan is not the case that you do enjoy if you have a credit card or a home loan mortgage. So those consumer protections needed to be in place. And it starts putting borrowers at an even level playing field with student loan servicers. So first and foremost, across the board, we need to fix the system itself. The federal government should continue taking a look at leveling that playing field. With this administration, the CFPB can continue to do more to do oversight on this industry. So taking a look at student loan servicers first and foremost, and different attorney generals across the states, have also started taking these servicers to task, and really pressuring them to face the truth about, what are they doing when they're servicing these loans for borrowers. And some, very scathing, reports came out and findings came out, and we're happy to see that some of that got resolved with the Navient case, at least. And so some borrowers got some relief and kind of recognition in that. But what states should also be doing, is continuing to look at what they can do in the consumer protection space, and then go beyond that too. What can they do for outreach and support for borrowers? There's, traditionally, again, it's thought of as a young person's problem. So financial aid is usually the conversation that happens, but we need to be talking about student loans in a comprehensive way if we're still funding our higher education systems with student loans. Hopefully we get to something more like a free college or debt-free college, but with the system as is, these conversations need to be happening in much more detail with students and families, so their parents also know what is available in financial aid. The campuses can do more here too. They can do outreach to students and let them know about different programs that maybe is specific to a campus or system that they are applying to, who can maybe help out more, with their institutional aid to students, so that they don't have to take out the loan, or the parents don't have to come in and step in, right? So across the board, our institutions can do more proactively to make sure that our students and our families are set up for success.
So you mentioned loan services, and I speak for myself when I say that when I'm signing up for a financial product, unlike my husband, I don't research enough. I don't put in that effort to get to know as much information. It's just me, or maybe it's a woman thing. I feel like I don't advocate enough for myself. So for women in my position, where you sign up for a product but don't fully read print, or you're trying to deal with a very difficult customer service person, what advice would you give them when you're entitled to something, you need more information, but you just either you forget or you just don't feel that mental strength to ask? We can start.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there is a cultural component to this as well. As women of color, we especially have different expectations and narratives given to us when we're talking about finances, who should take the lead, how to have those conversations, right? So, and again, from a first generation perspective, not a lot of know-how in navigating the financial structures here in this country, and understanding, what a credit score is. And then especially if you're putting this all in the context of, 17, 18-year-olds making this decision in college, about to go to college, it is, way overwhelming. So, I mean, first and foremost, And this does take a lot of time and effort. So I do want to acknowledge this for all the borrowers who've already had to deal with this, unfairly so, but it does take time and effort to keep calling, just keep asking questions, always follow up. And it is going to be a long journey. I hate to say it, but like, you cannot just take the first answer you get from a servicer as truth. Keep calling, keep pushing for what you want, make them send you paperwork, always, do that follow up so that you get the answers that you need and the paperwork. And then look for other narratives too. I think a great thing that Student Debt Crisis Center does here with their workshops and summits, you get to hear from other borrowers. So it really lifts that shame too, that we feel a lot of times that we are a community and not all, 4 million Americans can have been, not knowledgeable enough or tricked, right? Like, we are all smart people and hardworking people. This can't just be on us. So that's, always follow up, and it's going to take a lot of time and effort is where I'll start.
Sam, I want to add in that I love that point. I believe actually Fred Perry made a similar point on our last summit. A great researcher that, we have 45, almost 46 million borrowers. 46 million people can't be wrong. They can't all be messing up. They can't all be getting it wrong, so hundreds of thousands of you all have shared stories with us, and you are not alone. That's why we share the big number, or we share these numbers often, is just to let you know that you're not alone. And I think speaking up, you mentioned that, Arthi, that we have to be our own advocates, and we have to take our own copious notes. It shouldn't be that way, that especially when we're borrowing from the Department of Education, AKA the federal government, we shouldn't have to put all the onus onto us, but unfortunately that's the way the system is right now. And that's the best way to navigate through it until we change the laws and cancel student debt.
So that take copious notes, keep records, keep diligent records. How many services are we going through? I've done stories on people who have gotten public service loan forgiveness and bankruptcy, but man, they went through so much just to get there. So I think that is a useful piece of advice. Just keep any document or anything shared with you recorded, right? Jordan, I want to ask you about sort of the impacts that you see of student debt on older women. I think that we need to discuss that more and more. Young women, we have student debt, we suffer with it, sure, but older women have a unique set of circumstances. Can you speak a little bit to that and some of the work that you're doing and how it interacts?
Yeah, absolutely, Arthi. Thank you for asking that. And I know a number of people have been asking that question in the chat, which I think is so important. For older women particularly, so many of them have been told you have to go back to school to change your career, to get a different job. And often, frequently, older women, especially women who have been in the workforce for a long time, have also been in the space where they were suffering disproportionately, additionally, from the long-term gender pay gap that has existed over the course of the many, many years that they've been working. And so as we continue to close the gender pay gap ever so slowly, we are starting to make strides so that new generations of women won't have to deal with that gender pay gap. It's going to take a little bit longer, unfortunately, and hopefully not too long. But the reality is, for older women, they are facing even more continued barriers that will continue to be an issue for them. And I think also, we have talked about a number of different, generations of women who have faced student loan debt here on this call, but frequently we do, as Natalia said, think about it as current students and think about it as really young people. And the reality is we have to be having the conversation as an even broader group of women across the country and people across the country who face student loan debt. I think part of what the United States of Women is trying to do is really thinking about how do we break down barriers across the policy issues so that women can thrive at every generation of their lives. And so much of that has to do with canceling student debt, but also for many women who've had to be the supporters of their entire families, it is continuing to, if we're not fixing the childcare crisis in this country, if we are not continuing to increase paid family leave, if we are not working to find better jobs and better paying jobs for women across this country, it's not going to get better. And so we have to have an entire wraparound policy solution. And that's what the United States of Women tries to do, is really bring different organizations and individuals together to say, this is a whole series of things that we need to do to make it much easier for women and girls to thrive. And for older women, I think we need to make sure that we are including older women in these conversations and really thinking about how their voices can be a really important part of this conversation, both for themselves, but also for their children and their grandchildren, and the continued generations of people who are continuing to suffer from this crisis.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on this? 2 seconds. Okay, so I also want to talk a little bit about women enrolling at college at a higher rate than men. I know there has been some reporting in the news that we see a lot of men deciding to forgo college completely because they're able to find a job. So many job wanted signs available. The labor market is really tight, as they say in financial jargon. I'm seeing almost all of my friends have changed jobs, but where do women stand in this? We mentioned childcare. For instance, I moved out here because I need childcare for my baby. If I need to come back to work, I need someone to look after my baby. And I don't know if I'm going to, put him in daycare yet, because that's another expense, right? So did we go as far as men in gaining ground as this labor market gets tight? Did we lose out? Can you speak to that and sort of distill that for our viewers? We want to start with Natalia, because you have on.
Sure, and I think also would be great to answer this question too. The arc of justice is long, so I think ultimately we are gaining ground. But I do think in these past few years, it's felt like a step back, right? Having to make these choices again. My dear friend, who's the mother to my godchildren, stresses about the $4.20 an hour it costs for her daycare provided by her school, and will take him out of daycare because she can't afford that extra $4.20, for multiple hours. It's so unfortunate of so many women I know that are choosing between work or childcare. Their job just pays for the childcare and not making any extra. So we need to see wages rise for women. We need to see that, as Jordan said, we have to close that gender pay gap. We have a lot of gaps to close. We have to close the racial wealth gap. Canceling student debt will not solve all the world's problems, but it will help get us closer to that. It will help us on that road to closing these gaps that shouldn't be here, and will make us feel like we're gaining more ground.
Yeah, and the other thing I will say is, Natalia mentioned the wealth gap. I think that is an enormous piece of what we're trying to figure out how to fix here as well, is if we have student loan debts that are burdening our families across the country, there is no way that women are able to then build generational wealth that they can then pass on to their next, to further generations. And so that is continuing to hold women back. The other thing that's been really, obviously, an important thing to think about during this pandemic, and several of you have mentioned this before, is women were disproportionately as frontline workers, and we're not being able to have paid sick leave and paid family leave, and making sure that they were taking care of themselves during the pandemic. Additionally, we are in a place where women were also, as you mentioned, Natalia, only be able to pay for their childcare. And so many women made the decision to leave the workforce because it was less expensive for them to leave the workforce than have to put their child in childcare. And so we have gained ground back, and women have continued to go back to the workforce, but we know that there are still about 1 million women who have not gone back to the workforce at the end of the pandemic. And it's devastating to think about the economic future for women, and particularly, single women who are having to work several jobs to figure out how to put food on the table and to take care of their children and to take care of their families, and parents and grandparents and generations. I think a lot about the sandwich generation, which I feel like so many people are in the middle of right now, where they're taking care of their adult parents and also taking care of children or godchildren or grandchildren or whoever. And we are, by not creating wraparound policies for people, we are continuing to exacerbate that problem. I always think about how do we build a future that we actually want to live in? And that is about canceling student debt and really thinking about childcare costs and really thinking about how women can take leave if they need to for themselves for when they're sick, as opposed to just for children. And so we really need to level that playing field. And student debt is one of the many pieces of the economic policy agenda that we need to make sure we're moving forward so that we can. Inevitably, there will unfortunately be something again, like this major pandemic crisis. We want to make sure when that happens, we are not breaking the backs of women again, and we can actually make sure that they are coming out of this in a way that they can thrive.
So for, moving beyond canceling debt, let's imagine in a world where there is zero debt, but the cost of college still exists. Women, we came to this discussion a little bit later than men, right? We weren't allowed to go to college in many cases until very recently. We weren't allowed to vote until recently. But, do you still think that given the cost of college, how expensive it is, some of these for-profits are a little bit more expensive than nonprofits, is a college degree still a ticket to the American dream? Or, how do we get there when everything is so expensive? Do we negotiate lower rates? How do we even do that? Can one of you speak to whether getting a college degree is still the ladder up, so to speak? Do we want to start with Christy? Do you want to start us off?
That's a big question. I don't know if I have the answer to that question. And also, what are we defining as the American dream anymore? It seems like that's not even achievable for anybody in this country anymore. But I will say, I don't think it's a coincidence that the system is designed this way, that we're seeing these discrepancies, that the student debt crisis is affecting women of color the most. It's like not a coincidence. It's a very the system is going to remain this way unless there are advocates like us who are fighting for this cause, unless there's consistent pressure from organizations like all of ours that are represented here. I still value my college degree. I think it's, how it has opened a lot of doors for me. I know a lot of my peers who are women who have taken on student debt also still value their college degree. So I think that is still the way forward. Again, what we're talking about right now, it's the debt that comes along with it. So we really need to be kind of weighing our options on, how we can break this chokehold on women, and then how we can really figure out solutions for them to continue to get ahead in this country. But I still don't know if I know the answer to that one, if that still is if that's the key, again, if there even is an American dream anymore. So
you're so right, Christy. And so I think, yes, a college degree is worth it, full stop. But we also need to value work in the home, like Sam was mentioning, caretaking work, some college, like we mentioned before, getting, in a couple classes to get a certificate, trade school work. It's not just a college degree that's a ticket to whatever the American dream or, that feeling of success. I don't want anyone to walk away thinking it wasn't worth it. I value my degree as well, but it's not just all about a degree, even though we are Student Debt Crisis Center trying to fight to help you with your student loan debt.
So I guess we have a couple of minutes before we wrap up. Let's talk about solutions. Canceling student debt, Natalia and the rest of you believe, is the solution to addressing some of these deep issues that we have. What does cancellation exactly look like? You mentioned that it encompasses Parent Plus loans and all these different kinds of loans. Also, what happens after that? How do we address the cost of college? If you can, in a few minutes, explain like what is it that we can do to help women in the long term after canceling debt? Maybe you can start with Sam. I haven't heard you in a while.
Sure. I'll just kind of speak more on the long term here. Systematically, I think all of our institutions and governments need to step up and make sure that the system is working for all students, for all borrowers, especially women. In California, at least, there's a master plan for higher education, and that was designed very much in mind for a very white, male-dominated population. So let's just be real about that. That is not the demographics in California. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we don't see the amount of state spending and investment in our higher education systems with all these changes. So, you know, the states across the board can invest more in higher education. In California, there are programs that specifically take a look if you're a parent, if you're an older borrower. So, you know, certainly state and their higher education, you know, systems can work together to make sure that, again, everything is student-centered and actually taking a look at the lived experience of students going through the system. And then for borrowers on the back end, again, just supports that help people figure out the financial system here in America. What is a credit score? How do you, you know, work towards that number? How do you budget for owning a house one day? This is not taught in any systematic way, you know, in our colleges, in our K through 12 systems. We all just kind of figure this out. And those who have, you know, generations here in America with success stories or better off. So, you know, and especially thinking about the cultural gap here again, first generation folks, none of this is taught. And so, you know, there's no narratives for me to lean on how to, you know, to figure out how I'm going to budget all this stuff. And then also on the employer side, there really does need to be, you know, some, you know, addressing the racial bias there. And for women, especially valuing, you know, increasing the wages and, you know, and having those conversations about pay raises. I mean, that needs to be taught to young women and just women across the board, young or older. Sorry. So just, you know, our systems and our institutions really need to step up here.
Jordan, Christy, would you like to weigh in? Yeah, thanks, Natalia. You called me.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the first step is this cancellation. $50,000 is what we're all calling for, but hopefully all of it would be really great, as well as continuing to build a system across the country where we are addressing the cost of college, where we are addressing, you know, there are plenty of ambitious plans about free college, free community college. How are we really building a university, community college, technical college, certificate system that works for everyone? I think is really the next step of that. And then I want to build a little bit on what Sam said at the end of her remarks, is that, you know, the other big piece of this, especially for women, is making sure that we are working with legislators and companies to really think about how we are closing that racial and gender pay gap, how we are continuing to give women the tools they need to build generational wealth. Also, we are really making sure that we are removing the barriers that women are facing every day in all of their everyday economic security issues. So thinking about the comprehensive economic plan that works for women. So thinking about, again, childcare, child tax credit, paid family leave for all people and not just for childbearing people, really thinking about how we can support workers in the workforce so that they are not overly burdened by the payments that they need to make, but really we are thinking about how we can build an economic system where there is not a systematic bias and there isn't systemic racism and there isn't systemic misogyny, so that we can really make sure that the entire community here in this country can thrive, and really thinking about economic policies that can work there. This is a thing that we can really build on the back end of a pandemic. As we build out of it, we really need to think about how we build a system that actually works for everyone instead of building back to a system that didn't work for a lot of people in the beginning.
I can just chime in really quickly here. You know, I keep seeing it in the chat, you know, we trusted him, we took his word for it. Biden, through executive action, swipe of the pen, could solve this issue right here. You know, I think, you know, on the campaign trail, he made the promise of 10K. 50K really needs to be what needs to be canceled for each borrower. It's something that is so desperately needed that we're going to keep pushing for. And when we're talking about steps forward, it's all about pressure. It's all about keeping this momentum and energy advocacy high. Biden needs to know who who he's beholden to, who elected him to office, and that was young people. That was the youngest, most diverse generation in American history who took his word for it on the campaign trail, turned out in record numbers, elected him, elected Democrats. He needs to, really be in tune with what we're calling for if he wants to see us to continue to show up in the way that we just did. So that's how I'll leave Next Gen's voice on this.
And, I'm seeing a lot of you in the chat that have so much more debt than $50,000, right? We see you at 200,000, 300,000. You're right, Michael, 50,000 is not enough. It's a starting point. And as an organization, we are going to keep fighting to have buckets of $50,000 canceled until it's all canceled. We are, as advocates, we are not going away. We won't say, 50, we won, and now the org's over. We have to keep fighting until we have free college and wipe out debt for all of you. That's what we're all here for.
So a couple of things I just want to say I took away from this panel is that the system is not working well. And so canceling the debt seems to be a good restart, if you will, before we can sort of build a way that we can pay back these loans in a more fairer way. I also heard a lot about women shouldering a different kind of burden than men. And apologies to all those who think that this is gendering, you know what I mean, like if you think that is offensive, but women do shoulder, older women especially shoulder a lot of financial burden. Single women, just want to give a shout out to all of them out there. I don't know how you do it, but you're amazing women. And I also heard a lot about negotiating and like fighting for a higher salary, better terms on your income driven repayment plan and things like that. I believe there are a lot of resources out there that help you with this, but financial literacy is something that we need to continue working on. And that is something that I hope through my stories and through your advocacy work, we give more light to. But with that, I think we have run out of time. So I'm gonna, remind the panel, everyone, audience, remember you have to stick around for the next panel because there's gonna be more interesting set of guests, a whole day of events. But now I just wanna throw it to Vivek, I believe, who's gonna.
Actually, thank you so much, Arti. We're gonna run a quick video and then Vivek will join, but we really appreciate your time moderating this panel and all of the great panelists that we have on. So with that, we're gonna go on to our next panel. What does it mean to cancel student debt? And this is for all of you. And we hope you stay on. Thank you.
The fact that I still have this student loan, I can't keep deferring this loan. The impact on it affects my credit. As I try to build my business, I worry about them seeing this loan on my application. That's big. I'm an African American, 52-year-old male trying to build a business with this much debt behind me. There needs to be some change in how we do things and how school is offered. We shouldn't go in already knowing we're going to be in debt for 4 years. That's how can you concentrate in school knowing you're already going to be in debt?
So important for lawmakers to keep in mind that the choices that they make are not simply financial choices, that the benefit to the American people, the benefit to the country that we live in, of canceling student loan debt and of working to offer free higher education to the next generation of Americans is worth so much more than a bottom line. It's worth so much more than, a number at the bottom of the page or a signature on a promissory note. It is the future of our country.
Hi, I'm Alex Badia, U.S. Senator for California. Student debt cancellation is one of the most significant and impactful actions that President Biden can take right now, and in doing so, help move us towards a more diverse and inclusive economy. It's time to cancel student debt so that everyone can reach their American dream.
What a great panel we just had. Thank you everyone for joining us. You've probably seen the hashtag CancelStudentDebt on our various social media posts, but what do we actually mean when we call for student debt to be canceled? We're now joined by Kira Taylor, the staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, Kristen McGuire, the executive director at Young Invincibles, Mike Pierce, the executive director at the Student Borrower Protection Center, and Orlando Cabello, my fellow economic justice fellow here at the Student Debt Crisis Center, who are going to help us break down this hashtag. Moderating this panel is our very own Natalia Abrams, the president and founder of the Student Debt Crisis Center. Natalia, we're ready for you.
Thank you, Vivek. And thank you so much for keeping us going through this summit today. It's been a pleasure. And we're just so honored to have all these great panelists on. And I'd say friends. So I've been excited about this panel all day long. And I just want for the folks listening, and we have, over 1,000 of you. These are just by far the best advocates on this topic. We've been working side by side for years, and I don't think we'd be where we're at right now if it wasn't for the hard work of the folks on this panel, and then also the 400 plus organizations that are working so hard to cancel student debt. So with that, I want to get started with you, Kira. We've heard a lot today about the payment pause and payments being extended till August. And we know this administration has taken some actions to ease the debt burden for borrowers, including canceling debt for a limited number of borrowers. Mm-hmm. What's been going on? What's happened so far?
Sure. So the department, when this administration came in, took some long overdue steps to fix its relief programs. So the administration canceled the debts of some totally and permanently disabled borrowers using information that they had via the Social Security Administration. The department created a public student loan forgiveness waiver so that public servants could be able to take advantage of the loan cancellation that they were entitled to after 10 years of public service. And the department has made more findings so that students who were defrauded by their schools in particular ways, if they attended specific schools, could apply to get their debt canceled. Now, these are great steps, right? But they're incremental improvements to a monumental problem. And frankly, it's just not enough. There's a much bigger problem here. And the people who have received cancellation, now make no mistake, it has changed their life in many cases because, again, this relief was long overdue for those borrowers. But the people who have gotten cancellation, it's only about 1% of the 45 million people who have student loan debt. And frankly, it doesn't address some of the big problems within our student loan portfolio. So we know that our student loan system mirrors the gender justice and racial justice problems that we see more broadly in this country. We know that there are big problems with the student loan safety net, the income-driven repayment programs, big problems with how servicers have kept records of people's payments and even provided them with information about these various relief programs. The list just goes on. And oftentimes people may be eligible for relief under these existing programs, but they have no clue how to get there or how to apply. And if they do apply, sometimes there are paperwork errors that prevent them from getting that relief. So while these steps are good, they are just steps towards fixing the problem. These are not solutions to our bigger problem, and we really need much bolder action.
Yes, and thank you for your tireless work at NCLC, working with these borrowers and helping them try to navigate these programs. But you're absolutely right. We need to do more. We need to cancel student debt. And Mike, I think I do have you on the line. People say that student debt requires Congress to take action. We as advocates and so many borrowers say President Biden can do this with the flick of a pen. What's the truth here?
So I think there's a couple different things going on here. And thanks again, Natalia and everybody for the chance to join here. It's always great to be around and see all your faces and to help move this conversation forward. When people say Congress needs to take action here, in part that's because that's how most people understand American government works. But the reality is Congress did already take action here a half a century ago. The Higher Education Act of 1965 provides all the legal authority the president needs to cancel student debt for everybody. It hasn't been used in that way in the past, but it's been used over and over and over again for a half a century to cancel student debt when the Secretary of Education decides the circumstances dictate. And the only other thing I would add here is that there's also been a lot of conversation about taxpayers footing the bill for canceling student debt. And when you have that discussion, people think about Congress needing to spend money. And once again, Congress has already paid for these student loans that have been put on the backs of tens of millions of people. The spending happens at the time the loan is made, not when the debt's canceled. All the government's deciding here is whether or not to cancel the debt, whether or not to collect more money based on loans that have already been made and spending that Congress has already done. So I think the short answer is we have all the tools we need. We just need the political will to be able to cancel student debt for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I think one of the ways that we can get this done is by continuing to work with young people. And when we say that, we know student debt is not just a young person issue, but I, feel that so much big, meaningful change has come with the help of students and young people, engaging in the fight. And we have Kristen McGuire here, the executive director at Young Invincibles. And Kristen, I know you're organizing young people across the country. What has the organizing, the local level, and the state level, but what has organizing looked like for young people? Excuse me.
No problem. First, thank you so much, Natalia, for having me today. Like you said, I'm really happy to be in the company of friends. I think when we talk about organizing young people across the country, what we're talking about is a lot of work. We need to be able to meet young people where they are at a variety of employment statuses, looking at, living in multi-generational households. Something I've been hearing about and talking about a lot is talking to whole families, because as you said, student debt now I'm tongue twisted, doesn't only impact young people or current or recent students. It impacts parents who may have their own student debt, as well as parents, as we're seeing in the comments, who've taken out plus loans. And even to the point now where we have grandparents taking out plus loans to help their grandchildren go to college. So when we're talking about organizing, it's really a multi-generational approach where we're using young people to be trusted messengers to the rest of their families so that we can empower the entire household to help in this advocacy campaign to cancel student debt. So that means partnerships, right? Partnerships with organizations like ours, with AARP and other organizations who serve a variety of generational constituencies.
Yes, so true. And, I've always felt that we're all kind of worried about the same thing. What young people are worried about Social Security, just like, older Americans are, and older Americans are worrying about how to pay for college, just like young people. So we're in this together. And we're honored today to have one of our, at Student Debt Crisis Center, one of our economic justice fellows, Orlando Caballo. Orlando, can you speak a little bit about what you've been doing at UC Riverside and with college students across the country?
Oh, definitely, Natalia. And, I just wanted to say what an honor it is to be in this panel today. So over here at the University of California, Riverside, and, working with the Student Debt Crisis Center, we've been honored to be starting the Free the Degree Coalition, which is a coalition of student governments, student associations, and nonprofits helping get college students involved in student debt cancellation. And, we've been passing legislation and resolutions in like these individual college campuses and statewide organizations, helping add pressure to this movement to cancel student debt, and also helping combine the work that so many of these student associations are doing on the part of college affordability with the campaign to cancel student debt. And, we've been honored to have a number of resolutions passed representing almost 360,000 students so far. And, this coalition has just started just in the month of February. So, it's just ramping up and ramping up. So, I'm really excited to see where it's going to be taking us.
Yes, and congrats on passing the resolution at UC Riverside and for the entire UC Student Association. Great work. But again, we know and we see in the comments, this isn't just young people, this is all Americans. Kira, you work with a lot of borrowers, and we know that pandemic, at least right now, the relief is set to expire on August 31st. What does this mean for you and the people that you're working with?
So before I jump into that question, I just want to say one thing, because it's been really wonderful hearing Kristen and Orlando talk about younger students raise this issue up, because we know that this is an intergenerational issue, right? I hear from mothers, grandmothers all the time telling me how worried they are that they're not going to be able to help their children reach to college, that tell me that they needed to go get a college degree to be able to overcome systemic racism and gender bias, that they didn't have a choice, right? That who wouldn't take out the debt if they think that that debt is going to open up a better future for themselves. And so I just wanted to thank you, Chris and Orlando, for raising up those issues and for organizing people to raise these issues. Because I think a lot of the borrowers I speak to feel incredible amounts of shame for the amount of debt they hold. Oftentimes they're in debt for years, occasionally decades or multiple decades. And they feel so embarrassed that this decision that they thought was going to change their future and change their family's financial future has only served to weigh them down and to sort of steal their chances at creating more familial wealth. Now, on your question specifically, Natalia, about how people feel about student loan repayment restarting, I hear abject terror from the student loan borrowers I talk to all the time. And the thing I hear all the time is that, student loan payments have been turned off for 2 years and the government didn't shut down. That's number one. Number two is that the world has fundamentally changed for a lot of people. So they may be faced, they're in a different childcare situation. They may have faced a medical situation, a medical change for themselves, and they may be dealing with that they didn't have 2 years ago. They may be caring for family members who have had medical situations come up, where they have to sort of fill the gap for their families. And also, can we talk about the fact that going to the grocery store looks very different today than it did 2 years ago? And so they're having to stretch their paychecks further over much, much higher bills. And so they're right on the edge now. And when repayment restarts, they're going to be in the red. And so they're terrified and they're often ashamed. And they're kind of incredulous at the fact that our government would do this and that our government would be the lender and allow this to happen to them.
Yeah, it's this isn't a big bad company. This is the federal government. And that's just so always hard to reconcile in my head, that's who's causing so much problems for 45 million Americans. It's also who can fix the problem, right? And with that, Mike, I'm going to skip around a little because I know we are not the only ones who are talking about this, right? Advocates are not talking about it. Recently, Ron Klain, the chief of staff for President Biden, has spoken about it. Biden himself talked about this multiple times during the campaign, on the campaign trail. Where are we at with student debt cancellation? What do you make of all these comments, Mike?
I think it's a sign that the president's listening to us. This is the first time I'm old. I've been doing this for a while. And administrations in the past, at best, you get a pat on the head. People would pay lip service to the problems that people are experiencing when they have student debt. Just the very idea that having student debt makes it harder to put food on the table or to keep a roof over your head or save for retirement or buy a house. We have, I think, for the first time, an administration that's listening to people with student debt. And you see that in the fact that tens of millions of us have not had to make student loan payments for almost 2 years, more than 2 years. It also means that they can be persuaded. And I think that's the real opportunity. It's why we're all here today. It's why we all do this work all day, every day. Unlike the Trump administration, they are listening and they're not closing doors. And I think the most encouraging comments we saw were actually from Jen Psaki from the White House press briefing about a week and a half ago, saying that the president is open to canceling student debt for everybody. And they've been playing games for a while about this review from the Justice Department about legal authority. And it feels like the language about the final pause on student loan payments, whether they have the authority, all of that stuff has dropped out of the White House's talking points. And now we're trying to make a deal. We're talking about how much debt we're going to cancel, who's going to benefit from it. And we're all here saying cancel that for everybody.
Yeah, I always think Derek Johnson, the president of NAACP, said it best that if we can cancel the interest and we can pause payments, then we can cancel student debt. And you mentioned that, Kira, the world hasn't fallen, things haven't fallen apart just while debt has been on pause for the past 2 years. And Kristen, I wanted to ask you, when we ask what it means to cancel student debt, we also have to address the question of why do we need to cancel student debt? Part of the reason is that debt cancellation, as we've been hearing a lot today, is an economic justice policy that can help ease, not close, but ease and narrow the racial wealth gap. Can you tell us more about the racial justice implications with student debt cancellation?
Absolutely. And before I get into that, I would like to say primarily we've had a president who won based on the support of student debtors and young adults coming out to vote for the first time and in larger numbers than we've seen ever. So before we even get to the economic and social justice aspect, we have a president who made a promise, and we would like to hold him accountable to the promises that he made. So that's very important that we continue as voters and as the citizenry, that we continue to, let our president understand that we expect him to make good on the promises he made. And so at the very least, we would like him to cancel the $10K that he promised us. And of course, we would like him to go beyond that. And then when we talk about equity, which was something that the president also ran on, we have to acknowledge the wrongs that we've, the injustices that we've suffered in this country for hundreds of years. And when we have women, like your last panel talked about, and when we have Black African-American people holding the most debt in the country, and we have Latinos coming up at a very close second, what we've done is encouraged folks to go take on all this debt with the promise of the American dream, to only place another barrier in front of us once we did the thing we were supposed to do. I was listening to Kira when she was talking about hearing moms and grandmas, and it made me think of my own mother who told my brother and I, you guys need to go to college. I don't know how you get there, and I don't know how we pay for it, but you have to go to make a better life for yourself. My mom was a welder at General Motors, and she often told us, get paid for the things you know and not the things that you can do, because your body will fail you. And that's what my brother and I did, only to do everything we were supposed to do. We can trace our lineage back to American slavery. So I do come from a family who bootstrapped it literally, only to enter adulthood and have another barrier placed in front of me. And my story is not unique. You'll hear me say that many times. My story is the story of many, many, many people. In fact, my story is not the worst story that you'll hear when it comes to folks seeking higher education to try to attain this quote unquote American dream that we heard in the video. And it just becomes more and more clear that without cancellation, without this strong investment in the middle class, that there is no American dream for us without that.
Just want to take a beat and absorb that. It's just, thank you for, acknowledging that you're not alone. So many people are doing this, but I also just commend you on what you've done thus far, and speaking up for so many borrowers. It's really important. It's funny, I was taught that too, that from my mom, that my body would fail me and my mind was what would take me through. And that's why it was always, similar. I didn't grow up with money. How you have to get a degree. We're not even going to pay for it, but you got to do that. As we talked about in the last panel, it's not, we don't want to just cancel student debt for those that got a degree. It's for all college students or anyone that attended one class of college. And it's so important that we do this. We know that, there's already some laws that erase student debt for people. And one example is income-driven repayment plans that millions of people have depended on. I think the last count before the pandemic was somewhere between 6 and 7 million people were on those programs. Yet, as Kira mentioned, many people don't know about them. But recent data showed that only 32 people had their debt erased from these programs that are out there that are supposed to fix the broken system. This is infuriating. Kira, you're up.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head, Natalia. It is absolutely infuriating. And we, the National Consumer Law Center wrote this report with the Student Borrower Protection Center, calling attention to this only 32 borrowers have gotten cancellation. I think this number is even more shocking when you realize that 4.4 million people have been in repayment for 20 years or longer, even though in the income-driven repayment plans, there are different plans that have different terms. But all of the plans get you cancellation after 20 or 25 years, depending on your loan and what type of program you attended in certain circumstances. And that once you reach that 20 or 25 year mark, the cancellation is supposed to be automatic. You don't have to apply. It's just supposed to poof, happen. Okay. And so the fact that it's not happening raises the alarms. Now, we knew from government enforcement and private lawsuits that there have been big problems with federal student loan servicers. We know that they haven't been telling people accurate information about the income-driven repayment plans, and they haven't been making them aware of the relief programs that the Department of Education has. But NPR just had some explosive reporting about how the servicers haven't been counting payments consistently, haven't been counting them correctly in some cases. There are questions around whether or not the servicers have been counting folks who have been in $0 repayment plans. And this is really shocking because IDR is supposed to be the safety net that protects borrowers from having unaffordable monthly payments and also prevents their student loans from being a lifelong sentence, right? A burden that they're going to have to carry indefinitely. The other thing that's really problematic for me is that with income-driven repayment, it's sort of an all or nothing game. You have to reach the end to get to cancellation. And while you're on that roller coaster, because believe me, it feels like a roller coaster, you're watching your outstanding debt amount grow and grow and grow because your payments won't necessarily cover all of your interest, and the interest is not always subsidized. And so for a lot of people, if they can't reach that cancellation, they're dealing with a huge debt to income ratio, and that compromises their ability to get car loans, to buy a house, to have a good credit score. So this is really significant and serious for a lot of people. Now, the thing is, we as student loan borrowers can't do that much, right? Like if you've ever tried to log into your servicer and see your payment history, you will recognize that you may not have a complete payment history on there. And so it really turns on what the Department of Education will do to fix this huge, momentous problem with the system. And for me, I look at this and say, well, you need to audit all 45 million borrowers and make sure that the people who are entitled to cancellation can get it. And that's true for IDR, that's true for borrower defense, that's true for closed school discharge, another relief program that the Department of Education has for people who weren't able to complete their programs. But auditing is a lot of work. So if you don't want to audit every account, the alternative is do broad-based cancellation for all borrowers, just to make it easier to make sure that everybody gets what they're entitled to and to reduce the volume of people. Take it from 45 million and bring it down to like 5 million, 7 million. And that will make the job of making this problem right much easier.
Yes, absolutely right. I'm old too, like you, Mike. I've been doing this work about as long as you have, over a decade. And, I've been through different thought processes of how to fix it. Let's audit the borrowers. Let's, do different things. Ultimately, I keep coming back to let's cancel the debt. It's the easiest for us. It's the easiest for the government. Income-driven repayment was always said as the insurance policy for student loan borrowers. I guess they're right. Insurance isn't such a great industry. My insurance often doesn't work as well for me as I want it to. So in the negative, it's similar to that. And it's not just income-driven repayment programs that we've seen problems with. Mike, we've seen problems with public service loan forgiveness. And I know that your organization at Student Borrower Protection Center has worked super hard along with many partners to fix or do as much to fix the public service loan forgiveness program. Now, this program was supposed to erase debt for all those who worked in public service for over a decade, but the program has been riddled with problems, 99% denial rate problems. Mike, can you discuss what debt cancellation programs already exist under the law and what is preventing borrowers from receiving relief?
So I think you set that up really well. This program has been a mess from the jump. In 2007, Congress passes this law that says if you work in public service, and that's defined really broadly. So any nonprofit organization, any federal, state, or local government agency serving in the military, you work for 10 years, you make some payments, you get your debt canceled. That really simple promise turned into this technocratic nightmare for tens of millions of people, and particularly for folks that had these debts and heard this promise at the beginning of their careers, right when this program was first created. And kind of famously so, under Betsy DeVos, the first public service workers were able to apply to get their debts canceled. And 99 out of every 100 that did were told, no, sorry, this isn't going to work for you. Congress steps in, tries to fix it back in 2018, and 99 out of every 100 people that apply to that program also get told that they're not on track and they won't get their debts canceled. So Joe Biden runs for president, making big promises to fix the broken student loan system, not just canceling debt for everybody, but also finally delivering debt relief to teachers and nurses and other public service workers who've been stuck in this morass for a decade. And he comes to the same conclusion that Kira just did, that there's lots of technical ways you could probably figure out each individual mistake and remedy them. But the right way to do this, the just way to do this, the equitable way to do this, is to just brush aside all of those requirements and say, if you work in public service, raise your hand and we'll cancel your debt. And that's what's happening right now. So since October 6th, there's been this program, and it's got a wonky technical name. It's the limited PSLF waiver. But it has existed since October of 2021. And if you work in public service, even if you've already been rejected for public service loan forgiveness, especially if you've already been rejected for public service loan forgiveness, you can raise your hand again. And as long as you have a loan that's a federal loan, you can take some steps and get on track and get your debt canceled. And everybody else in the system, everyone who has not worked for a decade, is going to get credit under these new looser rules to be able to be on track to get your debt canceled. So if you applied for PSLF and were told no, if you applied for temporary expanded PSLF and were told no, try it again. It's working for people. The administration has canceled 7 times the amount of debt since October as in the prior 14 years. It is actually working. 100,000 public service workers have had $6 billion worth of debt canceled just since October. You can learn more about how this works. We've been doing lots of work with our incredible partners in the labor movement. Go to forgivemystudentdebt.org. That's a site that's run by us and American Federation of Teachers, National Education Association, and AFSCME. And there's tons of information about how to actually get on track to get your debt canceled. Sorry, that was a lot of words. I talked very fast, but check it out.
I think it's important, if you don't mind just repeating again the website of where folks can go.
Forgivemystudentdebt.org.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I know that it's so important, and we've been helping a lot of people with this public service loan forgiveness waiver as well. And just to remind folks, Mike's absolutely right. If you've been previously denied, if you're currently retired, the original program, you had to keep working. You don't anymore. It's been such a joy to see 80,000, 120,000 wiped away from borrowers that we work with that should have been done years ago, but is finally getting taken care of. Also, Mike, can you talk a bit, just continuing on this, of the deadline for this and the importance of that?
So I mentioned that this is called a limited waiver. As it stands today, right now, in April 2022, this is going to expire at the end of October. We're doing everything we can to get that deadline extended. But if you work in public service and you think you've worked for a decade and that you're entitled to debt relief, act now, don't miss your moment. The government is canceling debts for public service workers every day. And right now that is scheduled to end on Halloween, on October 31st, 2022.
Great. Yes. And reach out to anyone on this panel and go to forgivemystudentloans.org. I'm sorry, didn't mean to mess it up.
Forgivemystudentdebt.org. I'm going to drop it in the chat.
There we go. Forgivemystudentdebt.org. We've been talking so much, we say the word student loan borrowers all the time. Kristen, we hear from parents, young people, women. We just had a panel on that, people of color, that all say student debt is crushing them. Who is impacted? Who are you hearing from? Who are the student loan borrowers?
So I think, and the chat tells us as well, that it's everyone. Everyone who has had any type of interaction with our country's higher education system is likely someone who would be impacted by student loan debt. I think when we talk about impact, we have to think about, this larger framing of impact, because it's not only the borrower who faces the impact. We have spouses, we have children, and it's just the more and more that I start talking to borrowers of color, it really becomes very clear how much of a familial issue this is. And it also, even, I wouldn't say exposed, because we know there's systemic racism everywhere, but it shines even brighter a light on how women are valued in the workforce, and then how Black and brown women are valued in the workforce when we go to college, get the degree, and then go get the job and get paid less than most of the people who also are looking for the same job. So it's exposing that glass ceiling. It's exposing how the glass ceiling is even lower when we happen to be melanated entering the workforce. So when we think about impact, there's a variety of impacts. Folks' college debt now is impacting where they can purchase a home, if they can purchase a home, and where they can send their own children to school. And we as Americans should actually value folks who want to seek higher education, because it positively impacts our country, our workforce. And it almost feels like we're punishing people for doing the very thing that we need them to do to continue to elevate our workforce. So it impacts everyone. It will impact future employers. It's going to change the way we as employers have to offer benefits to employees. It's going to change requirements for jobs as people start to maybe think of other alternatives than going to college because they're trying to avoid debt. So even if you aren't, for example, a student debtor, you perhaps are a business owner, and this will impact your business. You perhaps are someone who likes to buy groceries, and now we'll start to see prices change. And I use that as an example because I really want to demonstrate how widespread of a crisis the student debt crisis is. I cannot belabor enough how impactful this is for every single person in our country, how student debt is going to touch each and every one of us, even if we aren't the borrowers. And if we are the borrowers, it's impacting our households in ways that maybe some of us can't even imagine. I was speaking to the press last week, and I didn't even realize that I am blessed enough to be a homeowner. But because of the pause, I was able to refinance, and I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And so when we talk about generational wealth, what that means, being able to lower an interest rate. And as we start to learn how to pass wealth down from generation to generation, because Black Americans haven't been afforded that privilege to be able to do that en masse. So student debt is something that my husband and I talk about all the time. Our combined debt, how do we get away from it? And how do we prepare? We have a second year student in college now, and we have a freshman in high school. How do we prepare our children to be able to not go into the same amount of debt that we went into? So student debt impacts everyone. And for families of first generation students, it not only impacts us, it impacts generations before us and the generations to come.
Yeah, so true. And thank you for speaking to, it's all of us. I always think that it's maybe 46 million loan holders, but we all have parents and children and family members. And so, I don't know how many people it disproportionately impacts, but my guess is a couple hundred million, 2/3 of our country or more are disproportionately impacted by student loan debt, either directly or indirectly. And Mike, I'm going to throw you a question that wasn't prepared, but I know you've been doing a lot of polling on this. And I think that there's so obviously the fact that so many people are impacted is why this issue is rising to the top. What does your data show on the desire to cancel student debt across student loan borrowers and the American public?
So we've been doing a series of polls going all the way back to December with Data for Progress. And what we found is that canceling student debt and pausing student loan payments both are broadly popular. And maybe the most interesting thing that we've seen in our polling is they're not just popular among people that have student debt. Majorities of people with no debt, majorities of people who didn't go to college, huge majorities of independents support canceling student debt for everybody. We've been testing this as canceling student debt for all borrowers. And One of the other things we learned is targeting that cancellation, picking winners and losers among the people with student debt doesn't move the needle. It's not more popular to just cancel student debt for some people. It's equally popular to do the right thing and cancel student debt for everybody.
And Mike, I just want to hop in on that because I think that sort of keys into something that people living with student loan debt already know, right? Like everybody at every program level is taking on student loan debt. They take it on to do certificate programs. They take it on to do associate's degrees, to do BAs, to do master's programs, to do PhDs. It is not just, the doctors, lawyers, et cetera, that have student loan debt. It happens to everybody. And I will say, since beginning working in this space, it has always been shocking to me how my neighbors come up to me and ask about student loan debt, how my husband is a veteran and people that he served with in the military have questions about student loan debt. Their spouses have questions about student loan debt. My mailman has questions about student loan debt. It is everywhere. But again, people feel ashamed. And so they oftentimes won't out themselves unless they know that you're rooting for them.
This panel is like, what does it mean to cancel student debt? And something we've seen through the chat all day. And Mike, you touched on this, but this is to the whole group. Does the president have the legal authority to cancel student debt? Is it that easy? Can he really just do it with the flick of a pen? Yes. Our lawyers on the call. Kira?
I mean, debt, student loan experts from Harvard Law wrote a memo on this issue. They found that within the Higher Education Act, there is the authority. There's this thing called Settlement and Compromise Authority, and it gives the administration and the Department of Education the authority to cancel debt, period, and stop. So yes, Congress gave the administration the power to cancel student loan borrowers' debt.
And is it right to say, again, to the lawyers on the call, that this has already been in use, like with what we've been seeing with the payment pause and the 0% interest?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different provisions under that same law that give the secretary this awesome, expansive authority to help everybody that has student debt. Joe Biden has canceled student debt for some people every month since he's been in office. And Donald Trump canceled student debt for some people every month the last year he was in office. And it is not radical, even though it might seem that way. We've kept the student loan system off. To Kira's point, right when we started here, we've kept the student loan system off for more than 2 years, and the world keeps turning. The government stays open, and everything seems to be fine. So I don't know why we would start it again.
Yep, the sky's not falling. Okay, so I think I just am so thoroughly enjoying this conversation. I really want to make sure that again, almost 1,000+ people that are listening and paying attention to this, how can they take action? What can they do? That's a big question being asked. So Kristen, let's start with you. Story sharing is a very powerful tool. It's something that I think all of our organizations do. What can people do to share their stories, and what impact does this have?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things. So when we talk about the impact of sharing stories, that is an excellent advocacy tool to help put real faces and real stories to what we're talking about when we're talking about the crisis. Someone in the comments said, I don't know the word for worse than crisis, but student loan debt in America is worse than a crisis. And I agree with that 100%. And how do we tell that story? We tell the stories like what we're seeing in the chat of folks being 75 years old and still having $200,000 in debt. Those are the types of stories that help with the advocacy campaign so we can put real faces. If we don't own the narrative of the faces of student debt, then we'll continue to hear we don't want to cancel because we might impact a millionaire. And that becomes the norm instead of the rare occasion. The norm is folks like us. The norm is we have a president, I'll say it again, who ran on strengthening and widening the middle class. We cannot do that if we're holding this much student debt. So there we go, catastrophe, calamity. There we go. There are some excellent synonyms for worse than a crisis. And so when we talk about how can we share those stories, you can share those stories by working with organizations that are here. We have Young Invincibles. Thank you for dropping our link in the chat. Young Invincibles, where you can share your story. You can also share your story with the Student Debt Crisis Center. And these are very important tools as this issue becomes elevated in the press and in the media. We need storytellers like you to put the real faces behind the student debt crisis or calamity. I think I want to change it now. I changed you guys Student Debt Calamity Center. And that's just what makes it real. And will your story maybe change the whole scope of what we're doing? Probably. The more and more, we see all the time when the president wants to bring the one person, meet Bob over here who this thing happened to. We need to be able to create those Bobs, right? Tell those stories and normalize student debt. We talked a lot about shame. We talked a lot about fear. We talked a lot of not knowing the future because of our student debt. That we have to break that stigma, and we have to show that all of us are student debtors. All of us are living whatever types of lives that we live, and student debt plays a huge role in who we are now and how we can continue to care for our families. So that's why storytelling is important. I encourage each and every person who listens to this webinar today to share your story, to sign the petitions that you receive, and continue to help push this advocacy forward. I feel very strongly that we'll be able to be successful in our movement to get student loan debt canceled. And I feel very strongly that we have a president who gave us his word, and that we should hold him accountable and ensure that the things that he promised us as voters, we receive those things. And in that tone, I'll also say, the days of blindly voting without ensuring that the promises that are made to us are kept should be over. We really, really need to hold our elected officials accountable on every level. And even work with them to ensure that what they can do for debt cancellation, or even to help remedy this from occurring in the future, we be a part of those solutions in our state and in our local government.
Yes, so true. I guess we're now Student Debt Calamity Center. We don't have to change our lettering. So thank you, Kristen. Mike, we know that voices of everyday people can make a difference. What can student loan borrowers and Americans alike do to make sure that our leaders in Washington and statewide are listening?
That's a great question. And I am going to answer a different one instead. A big part of the student debt crisis is widespread lawlessness by the student loan companies that have been trusted by the government to run the student loan system. And it is important to tell your story. It is important to hold our elected officials accountable. It is also important to hold the student loan industry accountable. And you can do that by submitting complaints to regulators and to law enforcement officials. There have been blockbuster cases against huge student loan companies like Navient and Sallie Mae that are the result of individual people raising their hand and saying something is messed up here and I need help. So it is really, really important that the people that do have the tools to hold these companies accountable have your story, can tell your story, can use your experience to drive better outcomes and to get justice for people that have been wronged. But that also feeds into the advocacy work that we're all engaged in every day. Part of the story of the student debt crisis is understanding that this debt is wrong and that this system is broken. And you sharing your story with a law enforcement official or with a regulator is a big part of how people that have power can get your back.
Yeah, and
I wanted to hop in really quickly and say another reason for cancellation. We talked about the government didn't even know how to manage the mess, so we need to cancel. The other part that I wanted to mention is the contractors that we hired to manage the mess also can't handle the situation on how to properly and legally collect payments and educate borrowers on how to enter repayment and how to actually repay their loans in a timely manner. So it appears at this point, no one knows what to do with the amount of money plus interest that Americans have been encouraged to borrow, which is another reason within itself on why it should be canceled.
Yeah, so thank you, Mike and Kristen, for bringing up the servicer issues. I think that's really important. We said on the last panel, I keep quoting Frederick Perry, who is on our last summit, who says 45 million borrowers can't all be wrong. They can't all be making the same mistakes. So kind of open floor quickly, speak to these servicing problems. What is going on, and why are borrowers constantly being put on the defensive?
So I will jump in and say that for many people that I talk to, when they notice that something has gone wrong in their student loan account, their first phone call is to their servicer to say, what can I do? And when that person says you don't have options or gives them the wrong information, it sends that borrower down the wrong path. Now, I will say, I know that when student loan payments get turned back on, people are going to be calling their student loan servicer. When I call student loan servicers with clients, I tell them this is going to be a long call. We're going to be waiting on hold for even today, like 30 minutes an hour. And I can only imagine how long the wait time is going to be when everyone is calling the servicers when their repayment gets turned back on. And given the problems that we know exist, I'm also really afraid for when those borrowers start reaching out for help, because the help won't always be very good coming from the servicers, just creating mass confusion and misunderstanding when repayment begins.
And our tax dollars pay for these servicers to get us into more trouble with our loans. Is that correct? Am I understanding this correctly? Yeah. I mean, just another kind of crazy thing. We're paying the government, they're supposed to help us, and then we're getting into more trouble, which is all the reason to cancel student debt. Kira, the kind of take action question to you. We know how much your team is leading efforts to address the problems with the broken loan system. What else are you working on, and how can the folks on this Zoom support your campaigns?
Sure. So what aren't we working on? Honestly, anytime it becomes obvious that there's a problem in the student loan system, we dive in and we try to investigate that problem and see what's going on behind the scenes. Now, in terms of what people can do, I want to echo Mike's call that, when you see something, say something, when you see that things are going wrong with your servicer. And in line with that, one of the other big issues we see are people who were defrauded by their school, who were promised one thing when they were enrolling, and then the school failed to deliver and didn't do it. We see it coming up more often with for-profit schools. But this is a huge problem, and people often don't know that they can use borrower defense to repayment to ask the department to forgive their loans. But I think in that case, if you see something wrong with your servicer, say something. If you suspect that your school has done the wrong thing, you need to raise the alarm, because that's the only way that advocates like me know that there's a problem that we should look into. I put our student loan borrower assistance website into the chat for you guys. We keep a blog where we talk about the issues that we're working on, and we have a share your story at the bottom of many of our blog posts. We rely on you and the stories that we hear from advocates and legal aid attorneys across the country to key us into what's happening, because I have my own student loans, but that doesn't give me a clear view into what's happening for other people who have different servicers, who attended different schools, et cetera. And so I want to re-up the call to share your story. And also, if you think that something has gone wrong, definitely check in with someone and verify that the law wasn't broken and that you're not entitled to some form of relief.
And yeah, we can't stress that enough, to definitely make your voices heard. We need to be speaking up for ourselves. I wish that wasn't the case, but we are our best advocates when it comes to this. And those complaints, especially with the change of administrations, they're being heard. We are hearing success stories from people contacting the student loan ombudsperson and voicing their complaints. We're seeing cases escalated. And if it's a public service loan forgiveness case, debt often forgiven or canceled because of that complaint. So it's really important to voice your complaints. And ultimately, though, we need to change the laws to correct these servicers. I always say, even if we cancel all student debt tomorrow, there's still lawsuits to be had, right, Mike? There's still Navient and Great Lakes, and what's the new Navient? Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so I see some folks in the chat that have talked about having their student loan company change already while payments are shut off. And I think one of the best things that has happened to people with student debt in this administration has been the government parting ways with Navient as a student loan servicer. But the company that took over for Navient, it's a company that goes by Advantage, has had its own set of trouble. And we actually just launched a new project with Communication Workers of America to try to hold this new company, Advantage, accountable for the problems the borrowers are already saying out loud right now while payments aren't even due yet. Lost paperwork, bad information. I'm going to drop another link in here with the name of the company, but it's Advantage. Everybody that had an education department loan that used to be with Navient is now with Advantage.
Yep. All right, just to change the directions a little and wrap this up. And Orlando, I haven't forgotten about you. I thank you so much for representing college students and talking about Free the Degree, the new campaign that you've been working on. And I know we have college students that are joining us today. What kind of actions are planned for the near future? And, for the students on this call, how can they get involved?
And thank you for that question, Natalia. So, just regarding Free the Degree campaign, we're just continuing to build the coalition. I think right now we got around students from 11 states, and we're just continue to reach out right now, passing resolutions, and just really keeping a collaborative space. So I just wanted to, just extend the opportunity if there's any students in this call, if you wanted to just reach out, feel free to email me here, and I'm happy to be in conversation.
Great, thank you. And yes, for any of those students, reach out to Orlando. He'll share his information, and there are monthly calls for the Free the Degree campaign that folks are welcome to join on. I will say that when I did get started in this space, it was hard to organize college students to care about canceling student debt. They definitely cared about the cost of college, but now we see how pervasive this issue is. And we have, the reason this campaign was started was students like yourself calling us saying, what can we do to help? How can we get involved on the cancel student debt issue? So I just applaud your work and thank you for everything you've been doing. And that goes for all of our panelists. I want to give everyone just kind of a quick shout out of, where are we at? What do you feel? How soon are we going to cancel student debt? And Mike, I'll start with you.
I think it's this summer. It makes no sense for Joe Biden to kick the can down the road just a little bit on the pause on student loan payments and to send his base, tens of millions of people, student loan bills just weeks before they go to the poll. I think he's setting up something big, and I feel good about it.
I got chills. Kira?
Yeah, I echo that. And I echo it for a slightly different reason, which is our student loan system is too broken to bring everyone back into repayment and to not have a tsunami of people fall into default. So I think there's a common sense reason too, to discharge as many student loan borrowers as possible from the student loan system so that we can actually rebuild a student loan system that works.
Kristen?
I agree with Mike. I agree with Kira's reasoning, but I think the logic behind it will have something to do with going to the polls. And I think that the pause was, just a small pause to get us towards something larger.
Orlando?
Well, I just want to echo what everyone is saying. I really think that, with people all coming together and just continuing their political advocacy, President Biden must, hear what people want to do in regards to student debt.
All right, so it's April 13th. We have less than 3-4 months to cancel student debt. So with everyone on this call, if we can go back to earlier this morning when Senator Schumer was saying, talk to 5 people, get them to write their Congress people and their senators and the president, get them to share their stories. We have a lot of work to do if we're going to cancel student debt by this summer. And I seriously got chills from this. I think we're going to do it. And it's because of you all on the call and everyone that's joined us for our summit today. So just so grateful for this wonderful panel. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Orlando. Thank you, Kira and Mike. And stay tuned for a special message from Senator Warren. And then with time permitting, we'll take a few of your questions. Cody?
All right, I'm jumping back in the conversation, having followed these discussions. I mean, we're now going into hour 4 of our event. We've heard from so many experts and borrowers, more importantly, from everyday people, which has been fabulous. Natalia said it. We have been teasing all day. We do have special remarks from Senator Elizabeth Warren. And before I get that started, I just want to give the senator a proper introduction, because Senator Warren really has been one of the most important champions for student loan borrowers. So it's my privilege to introduce special remarks from one of the earliest and fiercest champions for student loan borrowers, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, who is a fearless consumer advocate who has made her life's work fighting for middle-class families, like so many of them listening today. She's one of the nation's leading voices calling for student debt cancellation for many reasons: to boost our economy, to close the racial wealth gap for borrowers, and to put an end to predatory practices from student loan companies that harm and trap borrowers in years of debt. And so with that, I'm going to share a special recorded message from Elizabeth Warren. She could not be here today, but she wants to make sure that her voice is heard for these student loan borrowers who are joining us today. So with that, I'm going to get our video started.
Hello. I'm glad to have a chance to be here to talk with you all about the student debt crisis and its impact on borrowers and their families. I want to start by thanking the Student Debt Crisis Center for hosting this important summit and for your tireless leadership on behalf of borrowers. Since the start of the Biden administration, no American has had to pay a dime on their student debt. Now, I'm glad the Biden administration extended the payment pause again. It was the right thing to do, even if the extension was just for a few more months. But now the pressure is on for President Biden to follow through on his promise to cancel student debt. Student debt is holding back our entire economy. Borrowers and their families have trouble buying a home, buying a car, or starting a business. It's preventing a whole generation from living their dreams. Student debt is even forcing students to leave school before they get a diploma. Nearly 4 out of 10 student loan borrowers don't have a degree. They tried college, but life happened. They had babies, somebody got sick, they were working 3 jobs and then had to drop out, and now they are crushed with debt. Student debt is a racial justice issue. Borrowers of color take on more debt to go to school and have a harder time paying it off. Here's just one stat that should stop everyone dead in their tracks. 20 years out from having borrowed money while they were in college, the median white borrower owes about 6% of what they originally borrowed. It means 20 years out, they're still paying, but the end is in sight. The median black borrower still owes 95% of their debt. It must feel like they're going to pay until they drop. Canceling up to $50,000 in student debt is the single most effective action President Biden can take to help the economy and to advance racial justice. And the law here is clear. The president has the power to cancel student debt with the stroke of a pen. This is an opportunity to make an historic change for millions of people across this country. I think we're getting close to the finish line, so we can't let up. We cannot let this moment slip by. I am so grateful for your partnership. Let's stay in this fight. Let's get this done.
So there it is, folks. We have heard from advocates And we've now heard from lawmakers, all of which have said that debt cancellation is possibly on the horizon if we just continue to fight. I think that is such incredible news and gives me a lot of optimism. With that, I want to open the floor. Let's address some questions if we can. I've been flagging some from borrowers throughout today's presentation. I want to start with one that I think is one of the most important. A lot of older borrowers said, what about parents? If we cancel student loan debt, will parents with Parent Plus loans or loans for their own education be part of that relief?
I'm still reeling on the fact that we're going to cancel student debt this summer, but Parent Plus loans or parent loans or student loans or parent loans. You know, we apologize to the parents out there for constantly calling them student loans. But the truth is that's just the name the federal government gives them. Yes, Parent Plus loans are part of the loans when we talk about loans being canceled. It's all federal loans. And at Student Debt Crisis, we want to cancel as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, I, from day one, even when I was a bit younger, remember our organization always echoing the voices of parents and older borrowers. This might surprise folks, but when we talk about the 2 million supporters of the Student Debt Crisis Center, most of them are actually over the age of 30. And so our movement is driven by older borrowers with now this new support from young people. I love that Kristen said earlier that young people can just engage their parents and grandparents, help bring them on board. So there's a partnership. There's so many different generations impacted and also fighting for this reform. So that brings me great hope as well. All right, another question. A lot of people ask, is anyone talking about the problem of interest? So much of America's $1 trillion student debt crisis isn't even money that people borrowed. It is the money added on top of their student loans over many years of being stuck in this broken system. Are we hearing anything about interest? Is there anything in the works, or what could be done if not?
So we hear this a lot, and from a lot of you that are, support us at Student Debt Crisis Center, if we can't cancel the debt, let's just cancel the interest. I think Luis earlier today really touched on that. We can't, at least what the Department of Education is telling us, what the government tells us is that they cannot separate the amount of interest owed from the amount of principal owed. And so that makes it very hard for us to see exactly how much interest we would need to cancel. Again, why we should just cancel all student debt, because it's just far too complicated. I mean, this is coming from the government, not on an advocacy side, far too complicated to figure out the interest. And keep in mind, many people have borrowed at different years. They have multiple loans from grad school, from undergrad. Some loans may have been in deferment or pause, and it just becomes a big old mess. So again, the simplest thing for us, the simplest thing for the government is to cancel student debt.
I'm glad to tell you that you mentioned the all student debt piece. We've had some folks in the chat today, including PG, who's been really passionate in the chat, which I appreciate so much, about what we mean, again, when we say cancel student loan debt. And I just want to reiterate, when we talk about canceling student loan debt, the reason we had this last workshop, or this last panel, was to underline the fact that there are many different reforms happening, and they're all moving towards the same goal, which is ending the student debt crisis for everyone. But fixing public service loan forgiveness, cancel student loan debt for some borrowers. Fixing IDR programs, cancel student debt for some borrowers. An executive action on student loan debt would cancel student loan debt, hopefully for everyone with a federal student loan. And then there's work to be done for people with private student loans. And so, I want to just underline that our goal as an organization is to provide as much relief as possible. We heard from Charlie Eaton earlier, one of the researchers who showed that student debt cancellation is in fact progressive. Mm-hmm. Just to put it more simply, the more we provide relief, the more benefit society sees from it. And so all of these are under that hashtag cancel student debt umbrella, but we hear you all, we want to fight for the broadest, most comprehensive relief possible. That's how we'll end this crisis once and for all.
So yeah, we believe in canceling all student debt, but we also want to support those lawmakers that are fighting towards that goal, right? So when we see lawmakers support $50,000, that's a start. We said this earlier, that we are going to keep fighting for more buckets of $50,000 until it's all canceled. You have our guarantee that we will not go away as long as we can stay afloat as advocates. We will keep doing this. We know, I see you, Anne, 50,000 is not enough. I also am seeing, just to go back a second to the interest, that there are bills right now in Congress to pause interest indefinitely, so we wouldn't accrue more interest to our loans. But when we hear from borrowers all the time, that it's not the interest rate per se, it's the fact that it's all the accumulated compound capitalized interest that they've already have. So many borrowers, this is important, have paid off their initial balance. They paid off what they owed. We always hear that. Why don't you pay back what you owe? Well, people did, and they just owe interest. And that's why we hear from you. So we know when so many of you are saying cancel interest, what you really are saying is cancel student debt.
Yeah, so I'm gonna maybe do one or two more questions here. I see Anthony, great question about why other countries can provide a debt-free or free education. Anthony, we talked about earlier, we have seen our country pull back on its investment in higher education over the years. So that's the other side of this coin. We want to cancel student debt for those of us hurting with it now, but we want to also reform our higher education system in the future. So it's plain and simple. When a society invests in higher education, lifts the burden off of families and the finances of families, we can secure education that's accessible and affordable to all. I think all of us today agree with that mission as well. We didn't get to dive into it as much as I think we hope we could. That's for another discussion. But we hear you. We need to invest in higher education to make it affordable and accessible.
Yeah, and just looking through all your comments, Gordon, I hear you on bankruptcy. That is something that we support. We need, in fact, it's a misnomer. You can go bankrupt on your federal student loans. And just recently, Director Chopra is starting to go after that at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But it's hard. We have bills in Congress right now to change that. The problem is with that, not everyone is in a place or can declare bankruptcy. So we have to also cancel student debt. The way we're going to solve this crisis in the short term is canceling as much debt as we can right now, this year, this summer. That's probably not going to be all of it. We have to fix the existing programs. Which is income-driven repayment, public service loan forgiveness. We have to restore bankruptcy protections and make it easy for those that need it to get it. And then we have to keep fighting to cancel more debt and to make college free. This is a long road, but being in this space for over a decade, I have so much hope. I can't believe what's been done in the past couple of years in this space. And that's because of all of your hard work and all the stories that you shared. They are getting read. They are getting to the top.
Great. All right, two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up at 1:15. And I think this touches on two of the most important things we talked about. The first question, people are asking, where can they go to get help with their student loan debt if they're facing an obstacle or maybe are being harmed by their student loan servicing company?
So I hate to send you all to a government website, but you can go to studentaid.gov. That's the government's website. But if you don't want to do that, you can come to our website at studentdebtcrisis.org. And we have a helpful tools page that will help you with your student loan debt. Now, most of you, your loan should be on pause. And something that I don't think was mentioned enough today, we haven't acknowledged those FFEL, commercially held, I know it's a mouthful, borrowers that haven't. Keep in mind, there have been borrowers with federal loans that have been paying this entire pandemic. So we have to do something to take care of them. They have needed help, but with the loans on pause, you might not need help till August. I wouldn't wait on that. I would start looking at your options, but I also wouldn't pay my loans off tomorrow either, with all the great hope that we heard today of potential, loan cancellation in the summer.
All right, and the last question I want to address, for those who weren't with us at the beginning of the panel, today's events, one of the most inspirational things I heard, I think, was in the first panel where we heard from lawmakers, we heard from policymakers and researchers that taking action and sharing stories actually made a difference. And so I had a lot of people ask in the chat, if I sign a petition, send a letter, or take an action, like, does it even do anything, and what does it matter? And so I just want to address personally, as someone who helps organize borrowers to make a difference, every time someone signs a petition, sends a letter to Congress or the White House, or even shares their story, it actually does get in front of the lawmakers and policymakers that need this information to create change. We've heard from Senate offices and other lawmakers who said, hey, we got all those 100 letters that your supporters sent us. We hear you. And so it's just a reminder that taking these actions, sharing your story has gotten us this far, and it will get us across the finish line. And so we have to keep it up. We cannot become cynical or complacent. Now is the moment more than ever.
Yeah, and thank you all. So many of you have gone to our website during the summit and shared your stories. I'll repeat that again. Please join us at studentdebtcrisis.org. We want to hear from you. Bug your lawmakers, send letters, sign petitions, show up to events. It's so vital, especially right now. And, we will continue working to cancel student debt, but, watch this space, and we will hopefully be delivering really positive information this summer, but we cannot do it without all of our hard work. So just thank you again. And thank you for joining us.